The whole planet is in flames. This planet is Hela, the world, in which there were endless battles, terrible monsters, dragons and orcs, as well as an inconceivable number of victims. All this is a part of hell. People fought with this hell, and the protagonist was called here against his will. His whole sword, and later his hands, were washed with blood. Everything was in an unquenchable fire. The protagonist realized that this world is governed by the rule: either you kill or they kill you. He shouted to the other warriors not to lose heart, and after that, ordered to run into battle. Everyone immediately rushed to the enemies. In the blood were not only hands and sword, but the whole body of the protagonist, just like the others. The protagonist killed another enemy. Then he and the guy next to him stared stunned at something or someone. Cold sweat began to run down them. This horror was a demon, a real demon from hell. It was colossally huge. Its skin was brown and its eyes were glowing with orange light, as if flames were growing from its essence. It had mighty horns on its head. The protagonist stood right in front of it. They looked at each other. The guy put away his fear and gathered all his courage into a fist. Now he prepared his sword and was ready to enter the battle. He decided to go the last way. With all his might he pushed himself off the ground and flew straight to the demon's face, pointing his bloody cold weapon at him and shouting for the parasite to come here. The already embittered demon became even more furious. It seemed even the mighty flames began to blaze brighter. Some time passed. Sparks flew in the air and the fire burned all the same, though now there was no longer such a loud fight. All the people were dead and their bodies were burning. The protagonist spent all his strength. He had many wounds and scratches, and from the sword remained only a pathetic part. He was bleeding. But all was not in vain. The demon also no longer showed signs of life. He was lying face down. Judging by the pool of blood under him, you could understand that it was all shattered, like the last time, although maybe it was the last time, because the protagonist was left without an arm and was now flying to the ground, unable to help himself. He fell down, looked at the defeated enemy. In his eyes read no more strength, no spirit, no emotion, only post-mortem fatigue. The guy closed his eyes. The main character, the one who defeated the main enemy, was called Kong Hyuk. From now on this paradise of death will be his resting place. Suddenly, he opened his eyes. There was no blood, no abrasions, no wounds. He stood up and examined himself. Kong Hyuk was shocked that he was unharmed, but everything was wrong. There was a dark aura around him. Kong Hyuk didn't know what happened next, but he had a desire to control the creatures he defeated. Behind the guy he saw many skeletons. They had the same red eyes as Kong Hyuk. He stretched his hand forward and a black aura enveloped it. The more powerful Hyuk's enemies were, the more powerful his army became. Almost all the time people were opposing hell. Now Hyuk's enemies in hell were people who had very different abilities. Some were controlled by magic, some were nimble assassins, some were good with a sword. Finally, after 10 years of fighting strong opponents, he found a gate through which he could go to another dimension, but Kong Hyuk's brother wanted to go back to Earth. His brother was very different from him. He had blonde hair and brown eyes. Then Hyuk's hair was black and his eyes were militantly red. His brother gently suggested Hyuk to go with him. Kong Hyuk was silent. Then he lowered his head and closed his eyes and told his brother that he had done all he could for him, but that he would have to go it alone from now on. His brother looked at him understandingly and smiled. His eyes were kind. Kong Hyuk knew that his brother understood him without words, yet he had always been like this. He had been like this even after they had been drafted to Halo and before. During their time on Earth, his brother had always been smiling and friendly. Since Kong Hyuk's brother had returned back to Earth, 6 years had passed and Kong Hyuk had become a supreme necromancer, the victor of death that everyone feared, the leader of the undead who hated all living things. He was the only person feared and respected by the other necromancers. Kong Hyuk continued to live in hell, and did not want to return to the human world. After all, in this world, he could give free rein to his desire to kill, which he couldn't do on Earth. Hundreds of people had fallen at his hands here. It was the only place for an awakened necromancer like him. Kong Hyuk stood in this mess as a dead man, and he felt like himself there. The demon castle in hell was not at all presentable, and chaos was going on all around. Inside, someone sat on a throne. Instead of armor he had bones, and instead of a mask a skull. On the stairs to him climbed another. He had a staff in his hands, and on his shoulders and head a lot of chains. This was the very real spirit of death, Desmond Roderick. He bowed before the Lord and said he had an urgent report for him. This Lord was Kong Hyuk. He told Death to speak. Death knelt down and told him that the Lord's brother who was in the human world had died. At first, the Lord didn't answer or react to anything. But then his armor began to burn with a blue light, everything around him began to shake, and a black aura flew to his body. Lightning bolts penetrated the guy's bones and armor. Then there was a violent explosion that was accompanied by electrical discharges. The Lord turned to Desmond, who immediately responded. The mask fell off Kong Hyuk's face. He looked down at the death from above and said he wanted details. Kong Hyuk asked Desmond if he was saying his brother died, saying he wanted more details. Desmond Roderick, the spirit of death, is Kong Hyuk's right-hand man. His ability is that he sees every living soul in all dimensions. Desmond replied that by walking under the shadow of death, he is honoring King Hala, the lord of the demon castle. A picture of someone began to appear on the glass behind him. Desmond said that long ago, the Lord Kong Hyuk ordered him to follow his brother's soul in the human world, and he carried out that order, saying that only recently he was convinced that his brother's soul had been torn from his body. Kong Hyuk asked him to prove it. Desmond immediately got down to business. His brother began to emerge from the glass, his hair white. The brothers stood opposite each other. The brother's eyes were empty. The one who looks death in the eyes remembers everything. Kong Hyuk said that the brother looked exactly the same as the last time they met, but it had been 6 whole years since his return to Earth. The protagonist stretched out his hand towards his brother's body and used the dead man's gaze. The gaze was cloudy. Some 2 guys were standing on top. One's hand was covered in blood. He had long nails like claws. He exhaled and said he was glad he was finally dead. He said that even the world's strongest returnee couldn't handle them alone. He said that when you don't calculate your strength, you can get into a situation where you painfully die alone and no one would know about it. They looked at Kong Hyuk's brother's body and said that now that they had killed Kong Min, their era would begin. Desmond told the Lord that after his brother returned, they compared his soul to the souls of other earthlings, and Kong Hyuk listened intently to the death. He said that they had found out that his brother was the strongest among them, but there were plenty of people who were only slightly inferior to him. Kong Hyuk leaned on his arm. And then he said that they were advancing to Earth. This statement shocked Desmond and he asked again. The Lord told him to tell the 5 princes that he would summon them soon. This surprised him even more. Kong Hyuk thought about the 5 strongest necromancers that agreed to serve him after he broke the seal on them. Monsters that had existed since the dark ages of Hala and wrote history in blood. Only after defeating them was he able to capture the castle of the demons of Gargoa. All of these 5 necromancers looked completely different. Some were knights, some were mermaids, some were deaf, some were little schoolgirls. Kong Hyuk started to leave, telling Desmond that he was staying in the castle in charge, saying that he was sure that in his absence there would be plenty who would want to capture him. Desmond tried to stop his lord by saying that it was dangerous to go to Earth alone. Kong Hyuk replied that he would call for help if he needed it, said he couldn't take them all with him, and asked if Desmond knew what he was talking about. He replied that he did, saying that Desmond Roderick would always follow his lord's orders. Kong Hyuk thought about the metal men of Earth, the people who had evolved into strong and bloodthirsty creatures. He wondered how any of them could have defeated Kong Min, since they were nothing more than easy prey by Hala's standards. Yet they had killed Kong Min, who was winning here in Hala with him. Kong Hyuk was intrigued. He couldn't wait to taste these metal men. He smiled and told Desmond that he had no one else to kill in this world anyway. Kong Hyuk remembered turning to Kong Min. He said that they fought to the death for this castle. Kong asked if he really wanted to leave this world and go back home. Kong Min quietly turned to his brother, but Kong Hyuk kept going on, asking if he didn't realize that by staying with him, he could share power over this world. As Kong Min asked him, he wondered if after everything that had happened, he still felt nothing, even at a moment like this. To himself, Kong Hyuk realized that was the case. He was born devoid of the ability to feel anything, sadness, love. Sometimes he wondered if his ruthlessness was a help in Hala's world. and the reason he had reached the heights of power and strength here. At that time, Kong Ming held out his hands to his brother and said that whatever the case may be. He was silent for a while and hugged his brother, and there was a portal behind him. Kong Min said that he really hoped that one day Hyuk would feel cozy on Earth. Kong Hyuk was surprised by this. He wondered at that point if it was even possible to be cozy on Earth. He remembered that neither at school nor at work, he didn't feel at ease anywhere. It made him angry that the more people around him, the more it itched to kill. However, he knew very well that Kong Ming couldn't understand that, because he was normal. Kong Ming waved him off and told him that they wouldn't see each other until he himself decided to return to Earth. He really asked his brother to think about it. A portal appeared in front of Kong Hyuk and Desmond. Hyuk stepped forward. He thought about the fact that yes, he, Kong Hyuk, the supreme necromancer of Hala, Lord of Death, commander of the undead, filled with bloodlust for all living things, is returning to Earth for this very purpose. Desmond told the Lord that the gate to Earth is open. It was raining in Seoul, South Korea, and there were tall apartment buildings ahead. There was also a narrow alleyway. That's where Kong Hyuk found himself. First, his hand appeared out of nowhere, its appearance accompanied by short lightning bolts. Then he finally came out of Hala's world. He looked around and said that there seemed to be no one around. Desmond from that world told the Lord that he was safely back on Earth. Hyuk asked him if he had already notified the 5 princes. He said yes, and they said they would be ready to come at the Lord's call at any time. Kong Hyuk said that was great. Then he asked how much power he could use on the ground. Desmond replied that all he had. He said that the atmosphere was filled with mana. This also pleased the Demon Castle Lord. Desmond told the gentleman that he would be in contact with him all the time. He would be his eyes and ears. Kong Hyuk nodded. He was thinking of one important thing to remember. He was greatly confused that this wasn't the planet Earth he knew. All because it was now full of people who had awakened their abilities due to the disaster that happened 16 years ago. Now these metahumans had taken over many cities around the world, including Seoul. He also knew that just before he moved to Halu, many monsters and dungeons had appeared. He looked at something with his red eyes. In front of him was a tall and gloomy building with a coat of arms on top. Kong Hyuk said that the association was probably already aware of Kong Min's death. He decided to pay them a visit. 16 years ago, suddenly, portals leading to dungeons from other dimensions began to open all over the land. Terrifying monsters began to emerge from them. People who had previously been summoned to these dimensions also began to appear. These people were called the Returned. These people usually had incredible strength. Sochodan, Gangnam District. There was a beautiful tall building up ahead. This is the Hunters Association. Kong Hyuk is almost certain that this organization knows something about the circumstances of Kong Min's death. After all, he was known as the strongest among the people. He was already inside, and in front of the registration table sat 2 girls. They welcomed the guy to the Hunters Association. Kong Hyuk approached the table. One of the girls asked him how they could help him. He replied that he needed any of Kong Min's staff. The girl asked if he was referring to the recently deceased S-Class hunter Kong Min. She apologized but asked who he was. Kong Hyuk said he was his older brother. This surprised the girl. She asked again and said that Mr. Kong Min had no relatives. The other girl whispered in her ear to wait and asked if the gentleman had said he had an older brother. Then the first girl finally remembered and said that means he is the brother who refused to return to Earth. She asked him to wait for a moment. Kong Hyuk realized that it turns out, Kong Min didn't hide that he has relatives, but at least he kept silent about the nature of his power. Some guy in a beige suit came running over to them. He apologized for the misunderstanding. He said he got a call about him. He was running so fast he was out of breath. He said it was a big surprise and the elevator was too crowded, so he had to use the stairs. Finally, the guy introduced himself. He smiled and said his name is Hwang Sang-wook. He is the director of the emergency department of the Korean Hunter Association. Said he meant he was Kong Min's older brother. Kong Hyuk asked where his brother's body was. Sang-wook felt a little embarrassed. He wondered why he was talking so informally. Did he think that if Kong Min was his brother, then he was important too? Of course he didn't say it out loud. He just exhaled and said that first of all the association had to do some checks to establish their relationship with Kong Min. He thought about the fact that he was an A-class hunter. But he would be patient because his brother had died not too long ago, so he told Kang Hyuk to come with him. Kang Hyuk followed him and asked what the checks were about. Sang-wook said it was because after Kong Min's death many imposters tried to pass themselves off as his older brothers. Said that he was the strongest hunter in the world and had made quite a fortune during his life, so his sudden death caused a lot of anxiety in the community. He put a card to the counter and was given access. Sang-wook said that Kong Min had no heirs, so many imposters decided that this was their chance to get rich quick. Said that unfortunately for them the association had some information about Kong Min's older brother, so all their attempts were in vain. Said that they weeded them all out through a simple check. They were now riding in a circular elevator. They got out and Sang-wook kept saying, what if he really was Kong Min's brother? The genetic test would clear everything up. Now they were in a room with a bunch of computers and monitors. A girl with long golden hair greeted them there. Kang Hyuk was already sitting on a medical chair. He was told that they would do a quick blood test for mana and genetic information. Blood was drawn from his arm with a syringe. The girl checked everything on the tablet and cheerfully congratulated Kang Hyuk for being a metahuman and a mana user, as well as a blood relative of Kong Min. The girl said that he had taken a mana test and their genetic information confirmed their relationship to the deceased. Sang-wook was not happy about it, and Kang Hyuk didn't look happy either. Sang-wook said that since they had it all figured out, they should go up to his office, saying that he had something to tell Kong Min's older brother. He led Kang Hyuk and said that he was not just a hunter but the only member of the late Kong Min's family, so he couldn't explain everything to him right here. Sang-wook also noticed that Kang Hyuk's clothes were wet. He turned around and rudely shouted to some employee to call the supply department right away and tell them to bring a change of clothes to the emergency department. Ahead were the doors to the office. Inside, a jacket was hanging on a chair. Kang Hyuk silently buttoned the buttons on the white shirt given to him. The female employees passed by the office. There were tinted glass walls that could hear everything. The blonde girl asked the other if she had heard that Kong Min, the older brother of hunter Kong Min, had come to the office. The other was surprised that Kong Min had a brother. The blonde was surprised that her friend didn't know. She told the other that he mentioned it more than once during the interview, saying that his brother stayed in another dimension and Kong Min returned to Earth. The other asked how his brother stayed alive in that world. The blonde replied that she had no idea. She also said that Kong Min was a handsome man and his brother was the same. The other one said that she said that was exactly what she said. She just noticed that he was a little pale and asked if her friend thought so. She said that he just had light skin. The blonde girl said that Kong Min was in very good shape, but his brother didn't look strong at all. The other one agreed with her and said that he was more like a fragile and thin flower. Suddenly, Sang-wook ran out into the hallway and asked who was gossiping and shouted for both of them to go home. The girls felt embarrassed and apologized. Sang-wook entered the office and apologized for them. By the way, he and Kang Hyuk were now dressed exactly the same. Sang-wook said he reported to the president of the association and requested permission to disclose all information about Kong Min to him. He said that the personal information about the hunters was classified as secret because it was the equivalent of a country's defense information these days. The assignments his brother had received, his personal information, his abilities were all protected secrets, and only to confirmed members of his family could all information about his contacts, assignments, and the organizations he was a member of be revealed. Sang-wook held out the documents to Kang Hyuk saying that they had much more information about his late brother, but here were all the answers to the questions he was interested in. Kang Hyuk took the documents. At first he was silent, then he asked if they were following his brother. Sang-wook said that following is too strong a word. He said they don't follow their hunters' every move. They are the country's security, so they keep the leadership informed. He said they don't pry into the hunters' personal lives. It's a sensitive subject. They just gather basic information like in Kong Min's case. Kang Hyuk wanted information about his guild affiliation and personal information. He asked Sang-wook what was the reason for his death. Sang-wook exhaled and replied that he died in the line of duty. He said that he was sent on a mission to clean up a large-scale dungeon. It was a joint operation of hunters from several countries. Said unprecedented operation involving South Korea, Japan, Russia, the United States and China. A group of people fought monsters from other worlds. The hunter Kong Min slew the dungeon boss, but then died in an accident. Kang Hyuk silently sat on the chair and listened to the guy. However, No himself knew very well that there was no accident. Kang Hyuk had been able to see the last minute of his life using the Look of the Dead spell. Hyuk knew that he had been killed, and if the association wasn't aware of it, then someone had tried to cover up the circumstances of Kong Min's death. Sang-wook took out a key and said he was handing him the keys to Kong Min's property. He also handed Kang Hyuk a piece of paper with the address and told him to make himself at home and have a good rest. The protagonist looked at the keys and thought about the fact that he had to get to the bottom of it. Kang Hyuk decided to leave this place and Sang-wook said goodbye to him until the next date. The door slammed shut behind Kong Min's older brother. Sang-wook was terribly annoyed by Kang Hyuk's behavior. He wondered if this guy wasn't even taught to say thank you. He wondered if he was being so arrogant to him just because he was a returnee and he was an A-class hunter. But he decided that he should be careful with Kang Hyuk too. He recalled that when Kong Min returned to Earth, he had incredible strength and he knows that Kang Hyuk was summoned along with Kong Min, so there can be no doubt Kang Hyuk is also a carrier of immense strength. He thought about the fact that Kang Hyuk is still the older brother of the world's strongest hunter, the savior hero of mankind. Sang-wook stood on the roof of the association building and watched Kang Hyuk leave. He told himself that soon the news about him would spread not only throughout Korea but also throughout the world. It was already evening. Ahead was the high-rise building where Kong Min's apartment was. It was dark inside. There were various decorations on a white shelf in the living room. Kang Hyuk was sitting on a black sofa and reading some papers. The windows were open and therefore the wind was shaking the blue curtains heavily. Kang Hyuk was silent. He was looking at the pictures of Kong Min, each one of him smiling and happy. Kang Hyuk was thinking about what his life was like after he came back to Earth. Then he came across a picture of Kong Min with a red-haired guy. The main character realized that he knew this guy. He was pretty sure he was in the vision of the last minutes of Kong Min's life. Kang Hyuk also noticed that his brother and this guy had the same tattoos. He assumed it was a sign that they were in the same guild. Hyuk thought that he might be able to find something about this guild and this person, so he started looking through the photos further. Just then, he noticed something. He had a stack of documents in his hands, the one Sang-wook had given him. He said this was it. Up ahead was a sign that showed Sochodong on the left and the rest area on the right. A black car was speeding down the road. Kang Hyuk was sitting inside. He was thinking that according to the documents Hwang Sang-wook had given him, the office of the Gargoa Guild that Kong Min headed was in the center of Sochodong. Even though he couldn't find any information about the guild members, he still allowed that if he made inquiries at the guild itself, or better yet, met that red-haired guy, he could find out more about the circumstances of his brother's death, his car hitting some kind of sharp plant. Kang Hyuk held out a picture of his brother and the guy to someone and said he wanted that hunter in the picture who was next to Hunter Kong Min, asked if they knew where he was. The black-haired girl at the front desk looked at the photo and said it was the hunter Hwang Kyo. She asked if she could find out why he was looking for him. Hyuk told her it was personal business. He said he needed to see him in person. He remembered the guy's name, Hwang Kyo. The girl told him that unfortunately Hwang Kyo was not in the office right now, saying that he went to close the gate near Shinsa Station. She told the stranger that he could leave his name and phone number and she would contact the guild's external affairs department when he returned from his mission in a couple days. Kang Hyuk politely declined the offer. To himself he also recalled Shinsa Station. Ahead was the gate at Shinsa Station. It was the entrance to the subway. There were people walking there. Kang Hyuk was already going down the stairs. The gate of Shinsa Station was a portal to the underground in another dimension. It was blocked. Unlike Hala, on Earth mana was very easy to recognize, especially portal mana. Kang Hyuk stepped through the blockage and the guards were surprised. One of them turned to the stranger and asked where he was going, shouting that it was a danger zone. The other took him by the shoulder and whispered to him to wait a bit. He asked his buddy if he remembered that Hwang Sang-wook had mentioned that Kong Min's older brother was back, saying that this guy looked suspiciously like the late hunter. The first guard was surprised. He looked at Kang Hyuk who wasn't paying any attention to them and asked if this was it. The one and only relative of the famous Kong Min, Kang Hyuk. Kang Hyuk was standing in front of a rift in the wall from which a pile of mana was pouring out. The rift was blue and wide. It was the gateway to the dungeon. The guards finally said hello to Kang-san. One of them came up to him and apologized but said it was dangerous here. Kong Hyuk didn't answer. He asked if the hunters had entered the portal. The guard said yes. He told him that Hwang Kyu-ho, the commander of the 1st Assault Brigade of the Gargoa Guild, was currently doing a sweep of the dungeon. Kong Hyuk replied that he understood and said he would go too. This shocked the man. He asked him to wait for a moment because he couldn't just go there. He said that it was an A-rank dungeon and he had to be at least a level to enter. The other man pulled him back and said that he was Kong Min's older brother and therefore he must have a level even higher than this dungeon. Kong Hyuk, without saying anything to them, just entered the dungeon. The guard kept shouting that even so, he couldn't go in without the permission of the guild or the Hunters Association. He was turned to face his partner, so he didn't notice that Kong Hyuk had already entered at first. His partner told him and it shocked him even more. This time, all he could do was swear. Kong Hyuk was already in the arms of the gate. The guard said that they should just report it to the top, because if they tried to blame him, they would say he went in. He said the association would handle it. After Kong Hyuk started interacting with the gate, it turned red. The crack closed. Hyuk was already in the dungeon. There were dead bodies and many bones around. Hyuk noticed that the atmosphere here was much softer than in hell. It was for the best. He looked ahead. There were open doors and on the way to them were monster bones. From this, Kong Hyuk immediately realized that they had gone there. The protagonist stood by the skeleton of a monster that was several times his size. Its skull was intact. Kong Hyuk stretched his hand forward and ordered the skeleton to rise up. Blue mana flowed out of his hand. And some sort of liquid began to flow from the bones. Soon, the bones began to rise into the air. From them, the same skeletons appeared, a whole army of skeletons like hell. They told their lord to order. Kong Hyuk looked at them and told them to follow him. They all went up a long staircase. There was some kind of light up ahead. There was a guy shouting loudly while fighting someone. He was fighting a monster that looked like a horse. It had a massive neck and red eyes. The monster screamed loudly. In a blink of an eye, its head was severed from its body. The hunter guy smiled smugly. His eyes looked as if he was the ultimate psycho. He called the monster a damned thing. The blood from the large corpse of the horse was spilling and soaking into the long luxurious carpet. Behind the hunter who had just defeated the monster, there were 5 other people standing behind him. They were all already exhausted. The hunter was covered in the blood of his opponents. He shouted loudly that the horse was dead. The people behind him were cheering for another victory. One of the guys walked up to Kyu-ho and told him to rather drink the regeneration potion, saying that they didn't want him to suffer from the poison of that thing. Kyu-ho thanked him and told him he was a smart guy, saying he liked it. The guy smiled. Kyu-ho did too. He handed him a plastic bottle. Another asked Kyu-ho if he had set a record by killing the A-Rang boss so quickly. Everyone was pleased. Someone said that it seemed Hwang Kyu-ho had already overtaken Kong Min. The latter replied that he had long ago overtaken him in everything, just letting him appropriate the victory. Everyone was amazed and asked if it was true. Hwang Kyu-ho said that all those words about Kong Min being the strongest of the hunters, and asked if they didn't know it was all lies. One of the guys wanted to say something against it, but he embarrassedly said that Kong Min was really very, very strong. This statement did not please Hwang Kyu-ho. His eyes widened wide and his smile fell off his face. The guy behind him was horrified, and he asked if he wasn't. Then Hwang Kyu-ho put a smile on his face and asked the guy if he was a newbie. He told him to come over here. The guy obeyed the commander. When he approached, Hwang Kyu-ho kicked him painfully in the stomach. The guy was shocked. He couldn't expect this from his partner. Hwang Kyu-ho towered over him and glared viciously. The guy fell to the ground. Hwang Kyu-ho brazenly put his foot on his head and asked him who he thought was stronger, him or Kong Min, ordered the poor rookie to answer. The guy was trembling with fear. He realized that this was a huge mistake. His voice trembling, he replied that he thought Hwang Kyu-ho was many times stronger. Then the 3 smiled contentedly. One of the guys asked Kyu-ho what they should do with it. Kyu-ho smiled. He told them to read it and then come out. The 2 guys smiled and said it would be done. The white-haired guy asked Hwang Kyu-ho if they would meet at the same place as last time. Kyu-ho lit a cigarette and called them ugly and said that of course they would go to that place again. He stuck his hand in his pocket and said that they had done a great job today, so they would party together. The guy pulled a magic stone out of his pocket, saying that he would go first. A purple wall appeared around him and he smilingly told his partners to teach the newcomer a good lesson. "Just don't linger," they replied that there was and shouted that they would be there soon. When Huang Qiuho left, they turned on the newcomer. They called him a little jerk and asked him what his name was. The guy replied Daeho. "Oh Daeho." Poor Daeho was very scared. One of the guys sat down and asked him how old he was. Daeho quietly said he was 21. Then the same guy who sat down next to him grabbed his cheeks painfully. He moved closer and said he didn't like how insolent he was being, saying that if Kongmin was patronizing him, it didn't mean anything. Daeho replied that it wasn't insolence at all. Then the white-haired man grabbed him by his golden hair and called him a retard, saying that Kongmin was dead and no longer had a roof over his head, asking if he understood that, shouting that he'd better learn his place, and as soon as possible. Daeho asked for their forgiveness. The third guy said that if he wanted to ask for forgiveness, let him give his sister's phone number. He yelled that he heard he had a sister, not a body but a work of art. Daeho bit his lip. He remembered that when Kongmin was still alive, he had heard about what the hunters in the dungeons were doing. The Gargoa guild they led was the only one disciplined and didn't bring trouble. However, that only lasted when the strongest hunter led the guild. Then no one would even think of plotting crimes. Daeho remembered that Kongmin never let even the slightest mistake go down during dungeon operations, and when there were violations he always investigated thoroughly, looking for the culprit. Kongming had made many enemies with this, but no one could argue his strength directly. Kongming had fought the strongest monsters in the toughest dungeons. Daeho was living with his sister when his metahuman ability awakened. His sister took care of him always. Then he already knew about Kongmin because he was a human with no superpowers. To repay his sister for raising him, Daeho joined Kongmin's guild. Kongmin took him under his wing, protected him and looked after him. All was well until one day Kongmin passed away under mysterious circumstances. It was as if Kongmin had walked away from him. After his death, Daeho felt like prey amongst the other hunters. It seemed to him that they all wanted to finish him off. One by one these hunters who used to walk a tightrope began to show their true faces. All the guys in the squad piled on him and told him to bring his sister next time and then they would let him go. Daeho hated them and he had his reasons. He would have even killed them, but he was still a long way from their strength and he was well aware of that. The guys were mocking poor Daeho, calling him a jerk and asking if he heard them. Someone entered the room. Two noticed it right away. One asked who was there. Everyone turned around. It was Kong Hyuk, followed by an army of his undead. The main character asked them where Huang Qiuho was. One of the guys had blood on his face and looked menacingly at Kong Hyuk. The others were talking amongst themselves, asking who it was, and they assumed it was someone Qiuho knew. The guy with the sword and blood asked how he got here, shouting that there should be guards from the association standing at the portal. Kong Hyuk didn't want to answer their inane questions, so he repeated his question about where Huang Qiuho was. The guy replied that he had already left and then asked who the stranger was to him. Kong Hyuk licked his lips. He asked if he was late. Then he saw the beaten-up blonde stranger on the floor. He was shivering and looking at the guy. Then the main character turned to him and asked him if he knew where Huang Qiuho was. The guy screamed loudly. Now he was even more scared. The first guy yelled that he didn't answer his question. This made him terribly angry and he asked what the stranger had to do with Huang Qiuho. Kong Hyuk finally replied that he came to see him on personal business. Again he ordered them to tell him where he went. The guy asked why on earth he should answer him who appeared out of nowhere. They all started to approach Kong Hyuk, the guy asking why he was the one talking to him in an informal tone, asking if he knew him and how old he was. They surrounded Kong Qiuho. Now another one intervened, asking why he wanted Qiuho, saying they had never met him before, and asking who he was. Kong Hyuk turned around to him, his burning red eyes leaving a trail in the air. Without even using his hands, he pushed the guy away with a strong gust. It turned out that it wasn't just a gust, it was an arrow. It stabbed right into his chest. The guy was shocked. There was no way he could have expected anything like this. He coughed out blood. Then Kong Hyuk told the others that he was asking one last time where Hwang Kyu-ho was. The main character was emitting strong mana and his army was lined up behind him. The first guy pulled out his wretched blade and angrily called the stranger a goat. Then they all rushed to attack the newcomer. A rift formed in the air, then the crack began to widen. The skeletons also rushed to counterattack. A colorful battle began, undead versus earthlings. The first guy was slammed hard into the wall. Immediately a pile of his blood flew. The bald guy had already been impaled on the spear of one of the skeletons. All these spectacles were clearly very pleasing to the undead. They mounted and slaughtered the remaining ones. Only one Taeho was left unharmed by the undead. He was crawling on the floor and begging for help. The poor guy was terrified. Suddenly, the head of one of the guys cut through the air. It fell right at Taeho's feet. Here he was no longer so disappointed and scared. However, after realizing what had happened, he started to panic. The guys were fighting the undead as hard as they could, one of them asking what those things were. Then he finally realized they were skeletons. He wondered why he was getting hit. He didn't even have time to finish his thought when one of the skeletons thrust a long and sharp sword into his back. It pierced the guy through. The skeletons started to approach the terrified Daeho. He moved backwards and hiccuped in fear. Kong Hyuk started to approach him. He said the guy had one last shot at keeping himself alive, and Hyuk asked again where Hwang Kyu-ho was. Daeho stared at him in horror and wondered who he was, who had suddenly appeared, and why he wanted to see Hwang Kyu-ho. Daeho told him that Hwang Kyu-ho was probably at the Gangnam Club, his voice shaking. Kong Hyuk asked the guy if he wanted to live. Daeho shouted loudly and confidently that he did. Hyuk told him, in that case, to take him to the club. This startled and scared Taeho. Kong Hyuk had already started heading towards the exit when the guy said, to be honest, he didn't know the exact address. When Hyuk turned around ominously, Taeho hurriedly said he'd do anything to find the club. The dungeon opened up again, two guards standing right in front of the portal. They were very much surprised. Only two people came out of the portal, Kong Hyuk and Taeho. One of the guards asked if they were the only survivors. Daeho looked at Kong Hyuk and then shouted that yes. He said that the boss was just a beast. They didn't expect that. Then Kong Hyuk realized that people on Earth are now threatened by these monsters and really only the hunters know what's going on in the dungeons. He realized that the association staff had to take notes and blindly believe only what the survivors would say, and there was no way to investigate the deaths. The guard said that the monster must have been very strong indeed. However, he suspected something. He asked why Hunter Hwang Kyu-ho was not with them and how they managed to defeat the boss. To this Taeho had no answer. Taeho stammered. He decided to say that this man, Kong Hyuk, came and killed the boss. Kong looked at him. The guard liked the answer and said that it turns out Mr. Kong Hyuk did it. Kong Hyuk was silent and Daeho looked at him and asked the employee if he knew him. Daeho replied that Daeho probably didn't know yet because he'd only recently awakened his meta-human abilities, said that the guy next to him was the older brother of the late Kong Min, and said that there hadn't been any official announcements yet, but that everyone in the association already knew. The news extremely stunned Taeho. He was shocked that it was Kong Min's older brother. Then he stopped being surprised by his strength. He thought that just like his brother Kong Min, he is a returnee. Returnees are so strong because they were moved to another dimension, survived and returned to Earth. One such was Kong Hyuk. Daeho was biting his fingernails, thinking about the fact that Kong Min was known to be the last returnee. Despite that, in no time at all he had formed a guild and developed it to the level of the strongest guild in the world. Suddenly, the guard called out to Taeho. The guy even flinched in surprise, then turned around to him. The guard shouted to him that he was calling him and he didn't answer. He asked why they went out alone. Where was Hwang Kyu-ho and how could they defeat the boss if Hwang Kyu-ho was gone and all the other guild members were dead? Then Taeho said that Kyu-ho said he had urgent business and left using the teleportation stone. Then Kong Hyuk appeared and killed the boss. This shocked both guards. Hardly any of them expected such a thing from Hwang Kyu-ho. The second guard grudgingly said that he thought it was just a rumor, but now he was convinced. He said that he didn't understand what the Gargoa Guild was doing. They would have kicked him out and that was it. The first guard exhaled and said that while Kong Min was alive, Hwang Kyuho was very polite and diligent, but now he does whatever he wants. Kang Hyuk listened to their conversation carefully, looking at the box of magic teleportation stones. They were glowing with purple energy. Everyone knew that after Kang Min's death, Hwang Kyuho would often enter the dungeons and have his subordinates do all the work for him, and he would use the teleportation stone to move around. Kang Hyuk went somewhere else, and there were also complaints about Hwang Kyuho to the association, but the influence of the Gargoyle Guild was so great that the association couldn't intervene directly. In addition, there was a blatant power struggle within the guild itself, with many people vying for the vacant position of leader. Oteho grabbed Kang Hyuk's hand and said that they would be on their way. The guard told them that they could do as they pleased. He would put Oteho and Hwang Kyuho in the survivors column, and he also turned to Mr. Kang Hyuk and said he would put his name in the report as well. Kang Hyuk looked at him with his murderous gaze and said no. Goosebumps ran down the guards' bodies. They agreed and said goodbye to the guys. They looked back at them and one said to the other that he had goosebumps. The other said he did too. He said he was Kang Min's brother. He didn't really look like him. Oteho turned around. The guards were discussing the fact that he was a returnee, which meant he was very strong. Another said he thinks that's why he was able to fight the boss in the dungeon and take out the last survivor. One asked another who he thought was stronger than Kang Min or Kang Hyuk. The other said of course Kang Min. He said this guy looked completely ordinary. Up ahead was the bright yellow LED sign of the Gangnam Club. Kang Hyuk asked Oteho if he was here. He was talking about Hwang Kyuho. The guy said that it's one of the clubs he frequents, but he can't know if he's there or not, so he apologized to Kang Hyuk in advance and said that if he's not here, he'll take him to another club where he frequents. Kang Hyuk replied that Daeho knows him well. Daeho laughed and said that's not true, he just happens to be the leader of the squad he's in. Kang Hyuk asked the guy if he went clubbing with him. That confused Daeho, but he replied that he hadn't, and that he carried this with him everywhere. Hyuk stretched his arm forward and said they would go and look for him now. Daeho immediately started moving. They walked down the stairs to the basement club. Already there were multicolored lights. The party was in full swing. People were dancing and having fun. There was a brightly colored disco ball hanging from the ceiling. Kang Hyuk and Oteho made their way through the crowd. There were a lot of people here. Some guy next to them yawned widely. Now they were walking on a long red carpet. There was a guard in front. He was guarding a passageway to somewhere. The guard didn't say hello, only told them they were late. Oteho apologized to him and told him that Kang Min's older brother was with him. Kang Hyuk was standing behind Oteho. The guard questioned about the older brother. He stood in front of Hyuk. He looked at Oteho for now. Then he shifted his gaze to the protagonist. His red eyes stood out a lot in this lighting. The guard even felt a little uneasy. He asked why they had come. Kang Hyuk finally spoke up. He said he definitely didn't come to see him. Such rudeness startled the guard. Now he asked more aggressively if he was really Kang Min's older brother. Hyuk said he had already been told. The guard was getting terribly angry. Hyuk just had a talent for pissing off the environment. The guard called Kang Hyuk a jerk to himself. Then he had to calm down, because all the returnees are very strong. He looked at Kang Hyuk, who was very calm, and Daeho, who unlike the protagonist was very worried. He clenched his fists to move his emotions into them. He realized that he didn't need to have a conflict with the returnee at all. A normal metahuman would have had his skull bashed in for saying that. In the end, the guard exhaled and opened the door for them, saying to pass. He was just like the rest of the people. He thought that all returnees were the same. Kang Hyuk and Oteho entered the guarded room. There was a whole congregation of some people. The light inside was pink. Kang Hyuk looked over to some guy. He looked much more confident than Oteho. Up ahead, the protagonist saw a red-haired guy in a brown suit. The guy looked seriously at the strangers. Everyone was looking at Kang Hyuk and Oteho who entered. Kang Hyuk started counting the people sitting there. One was smoking a cigarette, another was reading a book. The third was red-haired and menacing. He was looking directly at Kang Hyuk. There was also a waiter. He counted 3 more people. There were already 6. And also another one, a man in a red vest. He was looking suspiciously at the guys who had arrived. Kang Hyuk counted 7 in total. But to his regret, Hwang Kyu-ho was not among them. The red-haired boy asked what they wanted and then turned to Daeho, asking if he was one of the boys in Kyu-ho's squad, asking what he had come with. Daeho told him that yes, he was one of Hwang Kyu-ho's subordinates, introduced himself to Daeho. Then the man asked who it was. He was talking about Kang Hyuk, who was standing next to Daeho. Then Daeho told him that he was Kang Min's older brother. This shocked everyone. Kang Hyuk turned to one of them and said he was looking for Hwang Kyu-ho. He asked him where he was. The red-haired guy smiled and said that means he's Kang Min's older brother. He stood up and walked over to Kang Hyuk, saying that it turns out that the rumor of the late guild leader's brother returning was true. He extended his hand to Kang Hyuk and introduced himself as Gu Kanam, telling him that he was the commander of the Gargoa Guild Assault Battalion. Hwang Kyu-ho was his subordinate. Hyuk shook his hand. Gu Kanam smiled and motioned for the guy to sit down. Then he quickly told the other to bring some drinks here, because the elder brother of the late leader had come to visit them, and they are sitting here. One of the guys stood up and said what was about to happen. He said that Kyu-ho was often here, and asked why Kang Hyuk was looking for him. Hyuk replied that it was for a personal matter, asked again where he was. Gu-chan felt a little awkward, so he came even closer and asked why they shouldn't sit down first. Said Kyu-ho has been getting into a lot of unpleasant stories lately. Said he can't say with certainty where he is at the moment. Said that Kang Hyuk could tell him his personnel file that he was looking for him, and he'd give it to him. This was already starting to make Kang Hyuk angry. He told Gu-chan to contact Hwang Kyu-ho immediately. Gu-chan was also unhappy. He called him a pig, because he persisted in his familiarity with him, thinking that he would have killed him. In fact, he couldn't believe that it was true, that this was Kang Min's older brother. Then he smiled, for he realized that he knew what he had to do. He decided that he would let it go down this time, purely because he was the returned one. Then he laughed a little and said that it was very hard to contact him, but he could send his guys to look for him. He again suggested Hyuk to talk, saying that they can't share personal information about guild members with the first person they meet. They're not a call center after all. In the end, Kang Hyuk had to sit down. The guy in the blue sweatshirt was already carrying a drink. Gu-chan handed it to Kang Hyuk. The protagonist thought that this was just a snake's nest and let them be deceived, because he didn't just come for Hwang Kyu-ho. He would kill anyone who had anything to do with his brother's murder. He was well aware that the killer could not help but have accomplices among the hunters, but he also realized that he should be patient and gather as much information as possible. Gu-chan sat down across from him and said in a friendly manner that it was for him to sit down to meet his older brother Kang Ming, whom he respected very much. Kang Hyuk ordered him to tell him everything he knew about Hwang Kyu-ho. He was annoyed at how clingy this commander was. Gu-chan said that of course he didn't know that much about him, but that they were getting along. The man in the red vest, meanwhile, was asking Taeho where the others were. Taeho asked who he was talking about. He said the squad that went into the dungeon. Taeho felt a little uneasy again, because he remembered the battle with the undead. The bodies pierced with spears and chests pierced. He quietly started to say what was in the dungeon. The guy talked for so long that the man had to ask what happened. Then the guy told him that they all died in the battle with the boss. This shocked the guys even more. One stood up, slapped the table and asked what monster was there. Taeho was even a little scared at such a sudden move. He told them that he wasn't really good with names, saying that he had never seen one at all. The guy that stood up got angry, started walking up to Taeho and yelling that if he lied he would kill him, ordered him to tell the truth. Taeho roared that it was true. This devilish thing was much stronger than they expected. The guy yelled that Kyu-ho said he killed the boss and left, leaving the rest of the cleanup to others, asking how Taeho could say all the guys were dead, asking in who was the liar here. Taeho was riddled with fear and surprise that Hwang Kyu-ho had come here, judging by the words. Their faces were a few centimeters apart. Taeho stammered and said that he really killed the boss and left. He stopped talking and the guy asked why he wasn't telling the truth. His veins were already popping from anger. Taeho said that while they were mopping up, other monsters appeared. Then the guy slapped him hard. This angered Gu-chan and he asked him what he was doing. The guy yelled that he was teaching the rookie a lesson. He said that he was pouring it on, that after killing the boss more monsters appeared and the rest of the squad was killed. He was acting like he was looking for an excuse. The guy said that he couldn't help himself and slapped him on the spot. Gu-chan said that they had an important guest and therefore he should behave himself. The guy replied that he would do so. He put his arm around the frightened and beaten Taeho and asked if he said that they were attacked by other monsters after the boss. Taeho said it was true. Then the guy asked how he survived being the weakest of the group, asking if the devilish things took pity on him. Taeho hesitated again. He was very nervous and looked at Kong Hyuk. Then he said he was the one who saved him, Kong Hyuk. For some reason this made many people laugh. Gu Chanu interjected that their late leader's brother had saved him. Taeho confirmed his words again. Then he turned to Kong Hyuk and asked what his abilities were. Taeho hesitated. Once again, he thought about the fact that none of the returnees had shown necromancy abilities before. This was the reason he was hesitant to tell the truth. He bit his lip, thinking that there was a possibility that perhaps Kong Hyuk would kill him if he gave away his ability. Taeho made the decision to reply that he had already told everything he knew. He could tell by how nervous he was. Kong Hyuk stood up and Gu-chan asked if they were already leaving. Kong Hyuk asked him what else they should talk about and Gu-chano said no, nothing. He felt awkward. It was probably the first time he had been treated like that. Hyuk left and told Taeho to go with him. Taeho wanted to follow the protagonist, but the guy pressed him harder and asked him where he was going, saying that they hadn't talked about it yet, so he was staying. Kong Hyuk gave the guy a murderous look, called him a jerk, and said he was going with him. The guy got angry and asked the honorable man if he was overreacting. Gu-chana collapsed on the couch and told him to let him go and let him go if he needed him. The guy held Taeho hard and said he hadn't told him yet how the men died. This was starting to piss off Gu-chan and he told him again to let him go. He said he wouldn't repeat it, and also asked since when he was interested in other people's lives. He called his subordinate trash. The guy had to let Taeho go, telling him lastly that he better get back as soon as he can or else he'll find his sister. Taeho rushed to Kong Hyuk and replied okay. Everyone was enjoying talking about Taeho's sister. They looked cheerfully at the backs of Taeho and Kong Hyuk. The door in front slammed shut behind the guys. It was illuminated by a pink light. Then the guy turned to Gu-chan, called him a piece of feces and asked when he learned to show off in front of the returnees, saying that the returnees aren't that strong. By the way, one-on-one yes, but he's as human as they are. Against all of them he doesn't stand a chance of winning. The other blonde guy said he was Kong Min's older brother. He said he told them idiots not to confront the returnees until they knew what their abilities were. He told them not to interfere when they first saw a returnee. The guy turned to the boss and asked what he told him. He asked if he told Kong Hyuk where to find Hwang Kyo. He asked if he was dumb enough to tell the first person he saw. Then the guy asked what note he gave Hyuk. Gu-chana replied that it was the address of the crematorium. He smoked and smiled. This amused everyone. One asked if he had sent a road-weary returnee to the crematorium. Another said that their caring boss Chana had sent him there just so he could sleep. A perpetual sleep though. A third asked the boss if he should warn the others, saying that Kong Hyuk might cause trouble. He was a returnee after all. Gu-chana replied that he would find other returnees in the crematorium and they would take care of him. The guy who was picking on Taeho asked why he wanted Kyo. Gu-chana told him that he thought it was suspicious too. He said that the returnees would beat it out of him. He still resented Kong Hyuk talking to him informally. He said that when he got a good beating, he knew that on Earth even a returnee had no right to cross certain people. So the guy asked his boss if he could go to the crematorium to see. Chana replied that the crematorium was not his sandbox and let him go back to work. Someone called him. The guy picked up the phone. Someone asked him what was wrong. It turned out to be Hwang Kyo. Gu-chano asked him where he was. He said he was having a good time. He asked if his guys had already come to see him. He told him to send them here and join them. He had a couple of fresh chicks for the boss. Gu-chana told him to go to his office immediately. This made Kyo tense and he said he would come as soon as possible. Gu-chanu remembered the murderous, fear-inducing look of Kong Min's older brother. He knew that the guys at the crematorium had to settle the matter with that brother, so he didn't understand why he was so nervous. Taeho and Kong Hyuk's car was parked in front of a gray house that didn't stand out. They looked at it and Taeho asked if he was here. Hyuk asked him if he knew what kind of place it was. Daeho answered that it was called a crematorium. He told him that the Gargoa Guild members who dealt with the aftermath of the dungeon raids worked here, and he asked if he had told Gu-chan that Huang Kyuho would be here. Daeho wondered what this Gu-chan was up to, because he realized that Huang Kyuho would never come here. Kong Hyuk asked what they were doing here in this building. Daeho thought Kong Hyuk was a strange man, as he wasn't interested in anything but finding Huang Kyuho. He told him that some squads are hunting for traitors of Gargoa Guild and spies from other guilds. After getting the data from this squad, the crematorium men arrest the spies and traitors and then make them confess under torture. Kong Hyuk understood everything. Daeho also told him to let him know that Kong Min had nothing to do with the establishment of this place and it was established after his death. Daeho also thought it was a strange person due to the fact that he wasn't at all interested in what was going on in his brother's guild. They were already at the door and Kong Hyuk asked if Huang Kyuho could really be here. Daeho replied that he wasn't sure and they would have to go in and find out. Kong Hyuk told him to lead the way. Daeho was surprised. Hyuk explained that since he's a guild member, they know him, told him to come over, introduce himself and tell them to open the door. Daeho quietly said he's never been here before. Then Hyuk turned on his murderous look and tone and told him to do what he says or else he'll die. This scared the poor guy a lot, but he agreed. He had to. He went forward. The people inside the building called crematorium were looking at the cameras. One guy told the other guys that they had guests today. Another asked who was there. The first guy said the deceased leader's older brother. The second guy asked if he really came. The other guy asked if he really came. The other guy was surprised that Hyuk was dumber than he thought. He asked if he even knew what this place was. The other guy said he was overconfident because he was a returnee just like Kong Min. The other guy said that was one of the reasons why he had ordered a long life. This guy yelled to the crowd of people that they were stupid and to go over there, saying that he got a call from Channa ordering him to escort the guests into their building and tell them that Kyuho was here, and the people understood. They left the room with the security cameras. The building looked like an ordinary, unattractive, office building. People were in a conference room. One of the young men asked what his abilities were. The man said he didn't know yet. Another asked where he was staying now. The man replied that he had sent him to Kong Min's apartment. At that place they would be able to keep a full surveillance on him. The man was Sang-wook. Someone asked if he suspected anything about his brother's death. Sang-wook said that it was impossible, saying that him appearing on Earth so soon was just a coincidence, asking how he knew about his brother's death if he was in another dimension, saying that he explained to him that it was an accident and he seemed to understand. The young hunters listened to him intently. Sang-wook suggested that they shouldn't make a big deal out of the usual returned. One guy got really angry. He yelled that they had forgotten how many people they had to sacrifice to get rid of Kong Min. Sang-wook replied that he recognized Kong Min was strong. However, it was very unlikely that his brother was superior to him. The guy asked why he thought so. He in turn suggested not to jump to conclusions until they knew more about him. Another guy told the gentleman not to be nervous and not to forget that there are many metalmen in the world and they are still improving their skills. Said that they were able to defeat Kong Min with the help of other returnees. Asked if they remembered that. Said that even if his brother is strong, alone against all of them he won't be able to resist. All over the world the hunters have taken over and the earlier returnees have created a system in the world that was only strengthened by the later returnees. Said that Kong Min tried to go against the system and what they ended up doing. The guy said that Kong Min was an unreasonable rebel, suggested that we should see how his brother turned out, said that if he was the same, we'd have to deal with him too. Someone called it a good idea to get rid of him if he was a troublemaker. Sang-wook told them that in a meeting with the president it was decided that they should look at his behavior for now and not do anything about it. Since they are the leaders of the Hunters Guild of South Korea, he felt it necessary to bring this to their attention. The guy in the red sweatshirt turned to Mr. Hwang Sang-wook. He said that he was obligated to find out the nature of Kong Hyuk's abilities. For other matters he may not even call him. He asked if he even realized how many projects he had burning right now. Sang-wook apologized to the leader for taking up his time. One behind the guys leaned thoughtfully on the microphone. A group of people in the front row were holding teleportation stones in their hands. One guy told him to tell the president to destroy Kong Min's personal file. Sang-wook kindly replied that they already took care of that. What he gave Kong Hyuk was just a personal file for internal paperwork. Someone told him to keep an eye on him and keep the others informed. The guy squeezed the teleportation stone. Most did as well and teleported out of the conference room. Sang-wook didn't have time to reply to the speaker that he understood. When they left, he snorted unhappily and said that there hadn't been a meeting yet, that they sent him to that wasn't without rudeness. He was very stuffy and straightened his tie. Kang Hyuk along with Oteho entered the crematorium. It was quite spacious inside. Someone came out and told them about the interesting people who had come to see them, and Oteho was frightened. He was a scruffy, unkempt guy with a cigarette in his mouth. He said he was Commander Kim, said he'd been working at the Gargoa Guild crematorium since he'd been back on Earth. The guy had a gun and was holding it in his hand. He said that Channa had warned him. He said he was Kong Min's brother, that is, their leader. Hyuk and Taeho listened to him in silence. Kim asked if it was okay to ask why they wanted their Kyo. Kang Hyuk replied that it was none of his business, saying he was told he was here so let him lead him. Kim laughed and asked if they thought it wasn't very polite to familiarize yourself with someone you were seeing for the first time. He even took his cigarette away from his mouth to say that. A man also appeared behind them. He looked much nicer than Kim. He smiled and asked if they understood that they were not treated like that here. Kim was very angry. He was asking himself what was wrong with this goon, as if he wasn't afraid at all. Kang Hyuk again told them to bring Hwang Kyo. Kim said Kang Hyuk would have to tell them why he needed him, because they don't betray their own. Then Kang Hyuk said he's giving them one last chance. Apparently Kim was having a lot of fun and asked why not too. Daeho was very surprised that he wasn't mad. Hyuk asked him if he said his name was Kim. He didn't wait for an answer but immediately added that he didn't want him but Kyo. Kim said that the Gargoa Guild doesn't belong to Kong Min. In other words, his brother, can't come here and dispose. Kang Hyuk smiled, almost for the first time ever. This made Kim angry. He asked if he was laughing at him. Kang Hyuk smiled and asked Desmond how many souls were looking at him right now. No one but Desmond could hear the question. Desmond answered his lord that 25 souls were in his vicinity. This pleased Kang Hyuk. He told him to keep track of their movements, and it was true that a good number of hunters had already gathered in the room. Kang Hyuk ordered them to wake up. All the hunters were laughing. Kim asked who was still asleep and then said that Kong Min's brother was ordering them to wake up. Some of them laughed out loud. Another one jokingly shouted to Commander Kim. Kang Hyuk was smiling, and then there was the Dark Azure Mana and the undead army behind him. When the hunters saw this, they shouted again, but this time not with laughter and amusement, but with fear. One guy was immediately torn apart. The other watched in stunned amazement as he quietly called out to the commander. Kim was not amused or amused at all now. The skeleton was already flying at him. He fired his firearm, his pistol. The bullet landed in the undead skull and cracked it slightly. However, the skeleton still managed to attack Kim, but it also managed to recoil. Kang Hyuk watched the battle. He asked himself if he was giving his bullets magic power. As Kim fired, an orange light streamed through him. The bullet struck another skeleton. It was like a flame, only it burned demons and all sorts of other evil things. Commander Kim fell to his knee. He was furious, calling Kang Hyuk a freak and asking how dare he attack them. The other guy rushed out. He asked what? From behind, something was preparing to attack him. The guy deftly bent over, somersaulted, and fired his weapon. It didn't hurt the skeleton at all. It was already quite close, and the guy yelled that it was difficult without magic bullets. The skeleton knocked him to the ground. The guy shot somewhere else. He shot at the red alarm button, and he hit right on target. He managed to damage the protective glass. However, the glass then the bullets are piercing, and so the bullet bounced off. This horrified the guy. He asked what he had hit. Meanwhile, the skeleton had already managed to jump into his chest with a spear. A lot of blood splattered from there. He screamed loudly in nightmarish pain. The gun he was holding soon fell to the floor. The commander's hands were shaking, but he still tried to draw his weapon. He pulled it out and hit the skeleton that was about to attack him again. The skeleton flew back a bit and Kim managed to pull his sword out of his chest. It was a very painful action. He threw the sword to the floor and it fell to the ground with a clang. Kim swore and fired a magic bullet, blood oozing from his chest. The shockwave of the bullet threw back even the guy. The skeleton was pierced and flew into the wall as well. Kim was thrown really far away and now he was just lying belly down. The gun wasn't far from his hand. Some kid ran into the room. He asked the commander what happened. He told them to arm themselves quickly and kill everyone. The kid rushed back. Commander Kim was also running away from the attacking undead. He ran through the place where Kong Hyuk was standing calmly. He was surrounded by a group of undead. Commander Kim shouted to Kong Hyuk that he was definitely dead from now on, asking if he understood him. Hyuk silently looked at him. The blue-haired guy was cornered, with Commander Kim standing over him and pointing his gun at him, two other guys watching him on the sides. Kim wondered how things had gotten to this point. Kim waved his hands like a psycho, a bloody knife glistening in his hands, towering over the pile of bodies dumped on top of each other, and Kim himself was covered in someone else's blood. The commander realized that he had lived so freely on Earth that he hadn't noticed how he'd lost his neck. He remembered holding the gun over the guy with his hands tied. He wondered why he had to fight a necromancer now. The undead army was closing in on him, and Kim wondered why it was Kong Min's brother who was the necromancer. Another skeleton swung at him from the back. Suddenly one of Kim's subordinates called out to the commander and the skeletons flew down one by one, their skulls crushed. The guys ran forward, to the aid of their commander. They approached him. One handed him a potion. Kim didn't really react to the guy. He just ordered the arrivals to kill them. Then he drank the potion he had brought. Green healing mana swirled around his body. When he was done drinking, Kim finally told them that he was Kong Min's older brother and he was dangerous. He told them not to play around but to go all out and kill him. The guy who brought the potion asked the commander if one of Kyuho's guys was around. What to do with him? Kim shouted that he should kill him too. Kong Hyuk told his new friend that he had nothing to fear. Daeho told Hyuk to be careful because they had special ammunition. He said that magic bullets could kill even undead with a few shots, and if they were sacred, even one bullet would be enough. Kong Hyuk took a closer look. The hunters were indeed armed and protected to the fullest. They took up battle positions in formation and started firing shotguns. The undead rushed to the attack as well. They dodged bullets. Commander Kim was terrified. He was asking himself what else was it? How could an ordinary dumb undead calculate the trajectory of a bullet and dodge? Kong Hyuk used his magic again. This time he summoned not skeletons but zombies. The hunters were terrified that this dick was a necromancer. Kim yelled that he already knew about it and ordered the guy to quickly carry his automatic rifle from the armory and give the others weapons too. The guy who was sent immediately rushed there. Kong Hyuk ordered his undead zombies to move forward and engage in battle. The guild hunters were shooting at the monsters, but they had already killed quite a few people. Unlike the undead, the guys were very scared to fight. They were gathering all their courage into a fist. One guy aimed straight at the skeleton's chest and fired. The skeleton was thrown back hard. But the problem was that the bullet flew through the holes between the bones. Now it flew straight at one of the hunters, who was just being humiliated by the zombie. There was a tremendous explosion. Kim was climbing up the stairs. The men were calling for their commander and Kong Hyuk ordered his undead to engage them. The undead threw themselves right into the fire. Kim shouted to his men to kill them quickly, telling them that the longer they stalled, the worse it would be later. There was a green-haired guy behind him. He told him that these were no ordinary monsters. The guy said Ki was right. They were intelligent skeleton warriors with combat experience. Kim said that no one had ever met such agile and strong undead in the dungeons. He asked where they came from. Commander Kim burst through the closed door. Suddenly, one of the skeletons climbed up the side of the stairs. And then the others. It turned out to be an easy task for them. Each of them had a satisfied face. They were heading towards their enemies. Kim and the green-haired guy got a big scare when the wall was breached. Skeletons broke into them. They were ready to tear the men apart. The green-haired guy stood up for his commander and pointed his gun at the undead. He didn't have time to do anything before one of the bony ones cut off his head. She flew off, the same screaming grimace still on her face. The skeleton pushed her straight towards Commander Kim. Kim decided that the best solution was to run away. He looked at the army and Kong Hyuk in the center and realized that it would be over. Worth it to kill him. He knew that necromancers were weak against physical attacks. Kang Hyuk was looking at him too, only as indifferent as possible. Kim jumped down and one of the guys immediately threw him a rifle. Kim reloaded it. He had to block the skeleton's attack in a flash, with the same rifle. He deftly pushed himself off the corner. Now he was flying at the skeleton from above. Kim looked terribly pleased with himself, like a psychopath. Kang Hyuk smiled as well. The red-haired guy shot one of the skeletons with his bow. It hit even the undead. Once again, there was an explosion. It was terribly strong. Luckily Kang Hyuk and his zombies were far enough away. It seemed like the skeletons became even angrier after that. Kang Hyuk ordered his undead to start. They immediately obeyed the order and rushed at the enemies. It seemed that even the undead were blazing with red fire. The red-haired guy was in a terrible tension just like everyone else. However, the guy didn't expect to be stabbed through with a sword right now. The skeletons were smiling and he was greatly frightened. Kang Hyuk used magic again and said to rise up. He raised his hand and more undead started to come out of the portal on the floor. Now the protagonist was surrounded by another portion of dead people, zombies and skeletons. Taeho was frightened. He asked himself if it was a skeleton archer. The guy thought about the fact that Hyuk can summon even the undead with long-range weapons. He is not a simple necromancer at all. The skeleton archer was standing right beside Kang Hyuk. The skeleton fired for the first time. Its arrows were magic arrows. One of them rushed towards the target with lightning speed. It hit Commander Kim's chest. Green mana began to flow from the wound. Kim was furious and terrified. Then another skeleton got very close to him. He knocked Kim to the floor and pushed his head through the floor. The impact was so strong that it not only made a dent in the floor, it literally crumbled it. The three other skeletons watched on. Someone landed neatly on the ruins. The skeleton gave way to him. Commander Kim was horrified. He told the guy he was a monster. Kang Hyuk stood in front of him and looked up at him. Kim yelled at him to stay back. Then one of the skeletons put a blade in his leg. A lot of blood splattered from there. Kim didn't expect something like this now. He was terribly scared. His hands were shaking from the pain and fear. The pain really was nightmarish. Kang Hyuk then asked Kim if he even realized what he had done. He towered over the guy. A shadow fell over his face, but the red eyes were clearly visible at all times. It looked frightening to say the least. He was saying that he should have just brought Hwang Kyu-ho in and none of this would have happened. Kim shouted that he was crazy, asking why he wanted Hwang Kyu-ho, shouting that Hyuk had made a mistake and not to let him think that killing him would solve the problem. Even though his words were loud and bold, his whole body shaking with fear, he shouted that Kang Hyuk would regret coming back to Earth. That's when the skeleton punched him in the face. Kim flipped his head into the floor. The skeleton held on to it. Everything was very painful and it was a real torture for Kim. Kang Hyuk said he should listen to what he was saying as he was being hit. Now the other skeleton plunged a sharp dagger into Kim's arm. Hyuk said he would give him another chance. He asked if he would tell him where Hwang Kyu-ho was. The guy replied to just kill him and that was it, saying he wouldn't hear anything anyway. He laughed after that. Kang Hyuk said he was sorry but he would still get all the information he needed from him, saying he was giving him a chance to do without. A purple depressing aura appeared around the main character. Now Kim was in a different room. The guy was pretty exhausted and his whole body was covered in abrasions and wounds. His shirt was also drenched in blood. His eyes were slipping but he saw Kang Hyuk telling him that after he died he would definitely tell him everything. Kim replied that he knew he was a necromancer. However, if he was thinking of using his body after he died he wouldn't succeed. Kim saw Hyuk order his skeleton to kill him. Then he walked away, and the skeleton drew his sword and smiled widely. This time, he didn't spare the man and thrust his weapon right into the guy's heart. The guy was stunned. He spit out a bunch of blood. A moment later, his arm fell down. Then Desmond told his lord Kang Hyuk that all 25 souls were at his disposal. Kang Hyuk applied the dead man's gaze. It was as if he could hear the late Commander Kim's questions to someone, asking who he was, if he was Kang Min's brother. Where is Hwang Kyu-ho now? You called him to the club. Kang Hyuk told Daeho that they were going back. He asked where to, if it was to the club. He asked why it was there and what he was going to do there. They stood by the car and Kong Hyuk said he would see for himself soon. The crematorium building was on fire. They got into the car. Kong Hyuk was driving. Oh Daeho was nervous. He wanted to ask what about, but Kong Hyuk immediately realized who he was talking about and asked what was wrong with him. Daeho replied that Hyuk had just killed all the crematorium soldiers. If they stayed out of contact for too long, the other hunters would come here and see what happened. Kong Hyuk asked him what about. Daeho already replied in a calmer tone that the guild would take revenge on Kong Min's older brother. They got into the car. Kong Hyuk sat behind the wheel. Oh Daeho was nervous. He asked what they would do about the crematorium. Kong Hyuk asked what was wrong with it. Oh Daeho replied that Hyuk had just killed all the soldiers of the crematorium. He told him that the rest of the guild teams contacted them from time to time, and if the crematorium stayed out of contact for a long time, the others would start to suspect something and come to check out the situation personally. Kong Hyuk asked him what about it. Daeho already answered in a calmer tone that the guild would take revenge on Kong Min's older brother. As they drove along the night road in silence, Kong Hyuk looked at Oh Daeho with a side glance, and the guy felt uneasy. He shouted that he was telling him because he might be in danger and he didn't care. Then he said that he was telling him because he was afraid of dying, saying that he knew that Hyuk was a necromancer and a very strong one at that. He said that this is the first time he's ever seen such dangerous creatures like skeleton warriors, so he's sure Kong Hyuk will be fine, but he's not. Told him that if the Gargoa Guild finds out about what happened in the crematorium, they'll come after him, because Gu Chanu saw that he left with him. Daeho was also worried about his sister as well. Kong Hyuk asked if that was all he wanted to say. Daeho replied that since he can control death, revive the dead there. Kong asked if he wants him to cover up the evidence by reviving the members of the crematorium. Daeho replied that no, he doesn't have to resurrect them, but wouldn't it be better to hide the evidence of involvement in what happened? Kong Hyuk replied that he doesn't need that trash in his command, he already has a team. Daeho told him in that case, do it for him. Kong Hyuk gave him a surprised look, then Daeho apologized and said he was out of line, but asked why Hyuk was doing it. The protagonist responded by asking him if he knew anything about the crypt sect. Daeho interjected. He recalled Commander Kim's memories of telling Chan to send Huang Kuzo to the crypts. Let him lay low for now. Daeho was surprised that Kong Hyuk knew about the crypts and he asked how. The protagonist said that he saw something about it when he was looking through the information given by the association about his brother. Daeho said that the crypt sect was a criminal organization, the biggest gang in the country, and after some of its members awakened, they continued their criminal activities with even more enthusiasm. Master Kong Min often ruined their plans, so the relationship between the guild and the crypt sects was always hostile. When the first dungeons and monsters appeared on Earth, it was thought that this disaster was the beginning of the human end, but after a while, some people awakened and some more returned from other dimensions. Since then no one used the term disaster. Humanity managed to adapt. Without hesitation many used their abilities to commit bigger and more daring crimes than before. Kong Hyuk asked if his brother had eliminated the entire crypt sect. Daeho said no, not completely. Most of the victims of the crypt sect were ordinary people, not awakened. Although many awakened people fall victim to them, many of them died because of the difference in abilities. Then they came after Master Kong Min as well. Hyuk told his buddy to continue. Daeho asked if it's really now, shouted that it's a very long story, saying that after all, they are a very famous gang of scum. Hyuk asked if there's a specific reason why they can't talk about it now. Daeho said not really, but if someone comes and sees that car. Kong Hyuk said he would kill them for him. Daeho was a little shocked. Then Kong Hyuk said he would do his job and Daeho would do his. He said to tell him all about this crypt sextet. Huang Kuho arrived at the club that Kong Hyuk and Daeho had already been to. Gu Chano asked him who he had already told about Kong Min's murder. Huang Kuho didn't know what the boss was talking about. He said he wasn't the kind of person to talk too much. Gu Chanu was angry. He yelled and asked why the fuck Kong Min's older brother, that bastard who just came back from another dimension, was sniffing around about his younger brother's death. Huang Kuho asked how he knew. He said Kong Hyuk just misunderstood and Gu Chana knows how well he got rid of all the evidence after Kong Min's death. He asked why he was sniffing around. Gu Chana replied to the brat that that's why he was worried. Huang smiled broadly and said he didn't have to worry about this minor problem, said that if he was so nervous, they could just get rid of the cause of his worry, asked if Kong Min's brother Kong Hyuk was his name, and then asked where the bastard was and promised to ask his guys to get rid of him for Gu Chanu's sake. This angered Gu Chanu. He asked if he thought it was funny, asking what he thought was so funny, and Huang Kyuho had to apologize to him. Gu Chanu told Kyuho to follow him, saying they would temporarily lay low with the crypt sect freaks. Kyuho laughed and asked why, saying they knew he had a beef with them. Chano said he should do as he said unless he wanted to die, of course. In the end, Huang Kyuho went after the boss. Kyuho pressed the button to leave and a door opened in front of them. Gu Chana said to follow him. Kyuho told him that he would only go if there were cute girls there. Gu Chana stopped and asked if it was a joke. Huang Kyuho realized that it wasn't appropriate at all and apologized again. They walked out the door and Gu Chana told one guy that he would be back soon, telling him to keep a close eye on anything that seemed suspicious and not to dare take his damn eyes off the surveillance monitors. The guy said that would be done. He looked at the mobile device. The guy was staring at the tablet. There was access to the cameras. Sighing and saying, "Here we go. He's having another day on the job as a watchdog." Suddenly, he was surprised and asked himself who it was, and on his screen was Odeho and Kong Hyuk. The other guys, noticing his reaction to something, ran up and asked what happened. A guy yelled that the older brother of the past guild master was here. Another was just as surprised as him, asked if he hadn't gone to the crematorium, yelled that Hyuk should have died a long time ago, asked what the heck this was all about. Did he not make it and decided to come back? Someone asked what they were going to do now that Boss Chana was gone. The guy was looking at the screen and was really nervous, so much so that sweat was dripping down his face. He told the others to contact Gu Chanu and take care of them in the meantime. The guys pulled themselves together. One asked what exactly they should do. He replied that he had already said he would take care of them, then yelled for them to tell the guards to let those bastards inside when they came up. Someone approached them. The blonde-haired guy told the other that he himself should know that the boss hated it when they made a mess here, offered to take them to the basement. The other called him an idiot and asked if he thought the returnee would happily agree and go to the basement with them, just because they asked him to. He said they'd just put up a barrier that would keep the place from getting dirty. Then he turned to one of the guys, asked him what he was doing, told him to get his ass up and start putting up the barrier. The guy put his hand on the floor, and blue mana poured from there. A dome formed in the room. He said the barrier was ready and now even if there was blood and organ spillage here they would just roll the barrier up and burn the contents. The guy laughed and said it was a good job, saying he was really unimpressed with this older brother of the past master. The other said that since he was a returnee, shouldn't they prepare to take some casualties? The guy asked again. The blonde replied that the bastard was a fucking returnee. He said he didn't think he'd let them kill him that easily without resistance. The hunter, who was asked to watch the cameras, called the blonde a moron and said they'd just outsmart him, asked why he had a brain at all if he wasn't using it. He started sharpening his daggers. The blonde-haired man caught the thrown knife. The chief hunter said that it was a new type of weapon developed by the crypt sect. It was probably extremely effective against the awakened. He offered to evaluate it personally. The dagger didn't stand out in any way, just a cold metal weapon. Someone asked him what he meant by it being just a knife, asking if they were just afraid that people would stop thinking of them as gangsters. The blonde turned to the bald man and asked what the difference between a regular knife and this one was. The bald man told him that if you stabbed someone with this knife, it would take the mana of that loser, whether he was a meta-human or a returning one. How would he use magic if his mana was sucked out to the last drop? He wouldn't. He'd just die. The blonde asked if they were going to kill him. The bald man said they'd look at the situation. If anything, they'd just tell the boss they'd gotten a little carried away and accidentally killed him. He knew it would only cost them a slap or two. The blonde looked at him and said that he was just crazy, and then bolted and said that if anything, all the responsibility is on him. He told him not to worry, because he himself will tell the boss everything. So, guys should not sit on eggs. It is better to execute his plan. The red-haired man smiled and shouted that the bald man wanted to take all the blame, asking him to give him this mana knife too. He also handed the other guy one of these. Then the people behind the door were asked to come in. Kong Hyuk and Oteho went inside. They were surrounded by the guild hunters. Daeho was getting nervous as he noticed that they had locked all the exits. He knew it would be like this. He knew that the hunters had found out what had happened and were waiting for them. Daeho wondered what he should do. There was no safe corner for him in this room. He realized that he would have no choice but to fight them together with Kang Hyuk. He looked at Kang Hyuk's back and wondered if they could handle everyone. Baldy sat on the couch and looked at the people who had come with wildness in his eyes. Kang Hyuk stood in front of him. He asked where the guy who was sitting here earlier was. Baldy was smoking a cigarette and said that, and Kang Hyuk apparently doesn't watch his language at all. He asked who he meant by that guy. Kang Hyuk thought to himself that there was no need to waste his precious time on them to find out where Hwang Kyuho was. Then he said that they had a chance. The protagonist was surrounded by people all around. He activated the awakening. His dark mana swirled around and his eyes began to burn brighter. Skeletons and other undead began to appear out of nowhere. Now it wasn't just hunters crowding around Kang Hyuk, but his dead army as well. This startled the bald man, and someone shouted, "Are these the rebel soldiers?" Kang Hyuk ordered his undead to move forward and begin the battle. One of the skeletons gathered magic in his hands. The lights went out and it scared everyone even more. The skeletons looked down on the humans. Then the bald man ordered the weapons to be drawn. One guy yelled out that he understood. The skeleton stabbed one of the guys almost immediately. The guy was bleeding from his mouth and parts of his body. The bald man was stunned. He told himself to stay calm, no matter how hard it was. From the sheer stress, his nose was bleeding. He noticed it, however all he could think about now was informing his boss. Baldy didn't have time to do anything before a couple of skeletons thrust long swords into his back. One put a sword to his throat. One of the skeletons grabbed the guy's head and that's when he realized that they were wrong. After all, Kang Hyuk is no ordinary necromancer. Blood spurted out of the guy's mouth. The bald man realized that Kang Hyuk. This was death itself. Ahead was a tall boring building. Inside, lights were burning everywhere. There were many people in one of the rooms. They were all happy and minding their own business. Someone was playing cards. Someone was fiddling with their phone. Someone was just looking out the window. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door, very loudly. The door opened and a man came out. When they saw him, everyone inside was horrified. They had sweat drops on their faces. One of the guys got up from the table and asked if they had lost. The guy was covered in blood. His clothes were also badly damaged, but he was walking confidently and loudly. This surprised the guys even more. They didn't realize what they were seeing in front of their eyes. It was the bald man, the one Gu Chano had put in charge. His face was extremely disfigured. There were huge blisters on his head, forehead and cheek, a deep seam on his neck, and his eyes. His eyes were black and his pupils were blurry and bright red. He was reaching forward as if begging for help. The guys were terrified. One of them yelled "Lie down," said he was about to explode. And so it did. The bald man exploded. There was an extreme amount of fire and all the guys were blown backwards by the shockwave. Meanwhile in the crypt sextet, this building was close to that one, but it was much smaller and the light too was less. A formidable guy with a skull tattoo on his arm lit a cigarette and asked if he wanted him to take care of his subordinate. Gu Chanu and Hwang Kyuho were sitting in front of him. Chano said it was only temporary. The guy took the cigarette out of his mouth and said he wanted an explanation as to why he had to keep him here. Hwang Kyuho intervened. He told Kyung Tak's brother not to be so mean. He said they were old acquaintances. He said it with a big smile on his face that wasn't sincere or friendly. Kyung Tak yelled at him not to laugh in his face, called him an idiot and said he'd kick his ass. He yelled that he didn't like the way he looked, his behavior and even his voice, telling that damn idiot that he hated every cell of his body, absolutely everything. Gu Chan and Hwang Kyuho got embarrassed and thought it was unnecessary. Chan told Kyung Tak not to say that. He said that whether he liked him or not, they were still part of the crypt family after all. Kyung Tak was really angry. He asked which family and since when are the idiots under Kong Min's wing part of his family. Hwang Kyuho wanted to say something in front of his brother. However, Kyung Tak yelled to that son of a bitch to shut up. Kyung Tak asked them idiots if they didn't say a word to him when Kong Min was alive, and now that he's dead, they came crawling back. The guys said they can solve all the problems later if he's worried, but Gu Chanu again really asked him to fulfill his request, saying he really needed his help. Kyung Tak told them to go to someone else, since he probably knows a lot of people now. Gu Chan told Kyung to go get coffee. The man immediately agreed. When he came out, Ken Tak asked Gu Chana why he cared so much about that trash. He asked Ken Tak if he had heard anything about Cha Yu-hyuk. Ken asked if he was talking about the first president of the Returnee Association. Chana said yes, about that monster. Ken Tak asked what's wrong with him. Then Gu Chana styles much more serious and tells him that jerk, Huang Kyuho, is his half-brother. This stunned Ken Tak and he asked if it was serious. Gu Chano made himself angry. He said that if it wasn't for Cha Yu-hyuk, he would have killed that idiot 40,000 times already. This made Ken Tak laugh. He swore and said that he knew he had someone behind his back since he was so arrogant. But something like that. Chana said that was right. He said it was Cha Yu-hyuk's men, an elite unit that the monster clan kept secret. Ken Tak thought about it and asked if he could work with Cha Yu-hyuk then too. He asked if he needed anything from him. Ken Tak said yes, many things, saying that not all hunters are the same as Chana knows. First of all, not everyone adheres to the logic of power like them, but recently it was revealed that there are also those who lack power even in the Crypt sect. Gu Chana replied that they could discuss it later. He again asked his interlocutor to hold that idiot Kyuho while he put in a good word with Cha Yu-hyuk for him. He asked his interlocutor again to hold that idiot Kyuho and he would put in a good word for him with Cha Yu-hyuk. Gu Chanu was serious. Ken Tak then asked how soon he would be here and lit a cigarette again. Gu Chana stood up and promised to contact him when things got better. He lit a cigarette too. He was worried because the guys from the crematorium should have called by now. He wondered why they hadn't contacted him yet. Then it occurred to him that something might have happened, and his phone rang. Gu Chana picked up the phone and asked what was wrong. The boss was told that it was an emergency. He was told that there was an explosion in the office and their guys were badly hurt. This shocked Gu Chanu. The loud sound made even Ken Tak's eyes widen. Chano asked what kind of bastard dared to do such a thing. Then they said into the phone that it was Kong Min's brother, the one that came while Gu Chanu was still there. The boss's heart dropped at his heels. He was told he was back. As soon as he left, the hunters in the office said to let him in. Well, they did. Out of anger and rage, Gu Chana squeezed the filter of the cigarette with his teeth. The cigarette caught fire hard and a huge flame protruded. This scared Ken Tak and he yelled for Gu Chanu not to play with fire here. He asked what the jerk was doing. Gu Chanu's hand lit up with a pink color. Pink-purple colored smoke also began to flow from the cigarette. This was Gu Chanu's purple flame. He was now in the most real rage. Gu Chanu called someone else. When the phone was picked up, he said it was him, saying that he was leaving for the organization's headquarters right now, ordering all the members of the assault squad to gather. The dead, completely bloodied guys were at the car, some leaning on it and some just lying there. Some of them still had their faces showing a scream. The entire ground beneath them was also drenched in blood. Kang Hyuk and Oh Taeho were there. They were standing over the bodies. They were now in the forest, in a closed area. Kang Hyuk used his magic on one of the guys. Oh Daeho called him brother returned and said what he wanted to say. He turned to Kang Hyuk again, so he did tell him that Gu Chana kept calling him, asked if he should answer. Kang Hyuk told him to answer. Oh Daeho took the call. From there Gu Chana yelled that he was a jerk and asked where they were now. Oh Daeho faltered. Kang Hyuk intervened, telling his buddy to tell him where they were. The guy's whole body was shaking. He was scared. He put the phone to his ear and started to tell. Gu Chanu on the line was furious. He once again asked the jerk where they were and then yelled for them to stay put. He yelled that he would finish them off if they ran away, asking if he understood him. Taeho hurriedly replied that he did. He finally dropped the call. Taeho thought about what he should do now. He thought that there was no way that Gu Chana would come here for nothing. He realized that he probably already knew about the club and the crematorium, and Taeho decided that this was their end. The poor guy fell to his knees, contemplating the fact that his life as a hunter was coming to its miserable end, bitter tears coming to his eyes. Kang Hyuk stared blankly ahead. He saw the memories of the guy he was checking out. There was a guy with ash blonde hair, a red head, and a golden-haired man discussing something. There was another person there. Kong Hyuk finally lowered his hand. There was a breathless body in front of him. He looked at it carefully, then ordered Desmond to give a report on the current situation. Desmond said that they realized his master was gone. Kong Hyuk asked him if they had done anything about it. Desmond said that they hadn't at the moment, but they were trying to find out where in Heol he was, saying that if they became aware that his master had completely moved to another dimension, there would be an invasion attempt. Kong Hyuk listened to him carefully, and then Death said that there is something else. Soldiers from the 1st to the 7th Legion want to be summoned to Earth where Lord Kong Hyuk is. Desmond said that the unquenchable thirst for death and blood of his lord's subordinates is growing. There are several legions of death under Kong Hyuk's command in Hell. If he summons them to Earth, the destruction of the human race will be only a matter of time. However, he can't summon them so recklessly. He must focus on distributing the power of the 7 legions to make the most effective use of each of them. Kong Hyuk told Desmond to tell legions 1 through 5 to stay put. He pondered the situation, then told Desmond that guarding the Demon Palace was paramount. He ordered him to call on the 6th and 7th legions. That should be enough. Hyuk said he would return to Hellu as soon as he finished his business on Earth. Desmond then told his master that more and more souls were approaching in his direction. Said that given that they seemed to belong to quite strong people, he was afraid that the number of soldiers his lord had summoned would not be enough. Kong Hyuk told him, in that case, to let the 7th Legion know that he would summon them when needed. Desmond promised to fulfill his instructions. The car came to a stop. It turns out there wasn't just one car, but 3. They were exactly the same, and all 3 stopped in front of Kong Hyuk. From there, armed men started coming out one by one. Daeho was terribly frightened. Kong Hyuk stood calmly, the young men carefully surrounding them. There were some who didn't have firearms, but perfectly sharpened swords and spears. A fiery attack flew at Kong Hyuk and his buddy. It wasn't an attack, but a teleport, a portal, and a guy came out and said that this was where Kong Hyuk wanted to die. The man was Gu Chanu, and he promised to send Kong Hyuk after his younger brother. Gu Chanu cursed and told Kong Hyuk that he must have a great nose for corpses. He asked how he knew about this place. Desmond seemed to appear behind Kong Hyuk. He told his lord that the souls of the 7th Legion were awaiting his orders. The protagonist closed his eyes and summoned the 7th Legion. Blue dark mana started pouring out of his body. Desmond replied that it would be fulfilled. Gu Chanu told him that he was very busy today, saying that he had killed many in the crematorium and then in the club. He called it a good job, and next to him, a bony hand started to come out behind the guy. Chanu noticed it and was greatly surprised. Then the ground erupted and Gu Chanu and another guy were thrown upwards. The unknown guy was holding a gun and asked what the heck this was. No sooner had he fired than someone slashed his metal weapon. The guy was stunned. His eyes opened wider when he saw a satisfied armed skeleton in front of him. The skeleton, without making the guy wait for long, thrust its sharp and cold sword into him. On the other side, the other guy was also attacked by the skeleton. Then Gu Chanu snapped his fingers and fire poured out from there. He spread his hands and the forest was engulfed in bright flames. By doing so, Chanu pushed back the 2 skeletons that intended to strike. When the attack passed, Gu Chanu shockingly asked Kong Hyuk if he was a necromancer. He said that would definitely explain the color of his eyes. He looked at them again. His eyes were dishonorable and bright red. Chanu said the mere sight of them made him want to finish him off. Out of nowhere a new undead appeared. This time the skeletons had shields. Daeho was as amazed as the attackers that they had shields. The hunters started shooting at the undead, but all in vain as their bullets hit the sturdy shields. The skeleton's hands grabbed the boy's legs, threw him to the floor and pulled him towards him. Then the skeleton stabbed the guy with his sword. He cried out loudly. The skeleton's hands started to burn. It was Gu Chanu's fire. He was cursing, for he realized that there were too many of them. He wondered who the bastard was. He also found himself asking if the necromancers had a limit on the number of summoned. The battle was fierce. Gu Chanu was burning the undead, but they were also killing more than a few people. Daeho also realized that there were too many. There was an army of undead in front of him. He stood behind Kong Hyuk and wondered to himself how he could summon so many rebels alone. Another skeleton chopped off the head of another hunter, who screamed loudly before dying. Then another was slashed through the stomach and back. And then a skeleton's limb was set on fire. There was an awful lot of blood all around. Gu Chanu was already exhausted. He was breathing heavily. Chana clenched his teeth hard with anger. His hands were blazing with red fire. He gathered a lump of flame and shouted for Kong Hyuk, "This thing is dead." However, something abruptly stopped him. He was greatly surprised. And it was all about the fact that one of the skeletons had already managed to chop off his hand. Now, Gu-chan had nothing to contain the fire. His eyes opened wide. A pile of fire fell right on top of him. Poor Gu-chana rolled around on the ground, trying to brush it off, to put it out. That's when Kong Hyuk decided to come closer to him. Now he was standing right above him. Gu-chana had one hand cut off and a lot of blood was flowing from there. He was trying to get up. Then he did raise his eyes to Kong Hyuk. Kong Hyuk looked down at him, but with a completely emotionless gaze. Kong Hyuk stood there for a moment and then said to Gu-chan to rest in peace. After saying this, the skeleton stabbed his sword into his back. Gu-chani was stunned. He did not expect it so soon. A lot of blood came out of his mouth. Kong Hyuk used the dead man's gaze on him too. He told Desmond to write down everything Hyuk was seeing now. Desmond replied to his lord that he was already on it. He told him that they knew their faces, names, voices and the location of their souls. Kong Hyuk told him to summon Dullahan of the 7th Legion. Desmond promised to give him his command. Suddenly, a purple light began to erupt from the ground. Then, there was an explosion. From there, a blonde-haired guy wearing a black robe appeared. He was holding a magic staff with small skulls on the branches. He bowed before Kong Hyuk and said that Lamer Dullahan of the 7th Legion had received his master's summons and humbly appeared before him. He apologized to his lord for any missteps he had made. Lamore bowed before his lord. Kong Hyuk. Daeho watched this. He marveled at the lad's voice, for he had never heard anything like it before. Kong Hyuk told the arrival that he had something to tell him. Lamer replied that he was waiting for his orders. Kong Hyuk then told him that Desmond would show him the memories he had seen through the eyes of the dead man, ordered him to fill the minds of those who had killed his brother with nightmares. Lamore nodded. Then he smiled broadly and said that he had beheld all those whom the Lord had seen, promising to fulfill his command. Next, Lamore turned to Gu-chan and asked his lord if he could start with him. He placed his hand on the lad's head and raised his magic staff upwards. The roots of the staff glowed with purple mana. Then, those roots started sprouting towards Gu-chan's body. They climbed through his clothes, went into his mouth and hair. The roots touched Gu-chanu's forehead. His mouth opened wide. His pupils were blank. Lamore was watching with a psychotic smile. Kong Hyuk was as calm as ever, but Taeho was uncomfortable. He was asking himself what was going on. Was he really absorbing Gu-chanu's mana? In a flash he realized he was wrong. The staff was not absorbing mana, but his blood, and the branches of the staff were lying along the guy's veins. The skulls on the branches began to take on new shapes, which surprised Taeho. With horror the poor fellow fell to the ground. From the branches the faces of the dead hunters looked straight at him. Taeho recognized the president of the organization, Kong Chang-soo, his face there. Also Cha Yu-hyuk was there, and Hwang Kyu-ho was there. Taeho met them as he followed Guild Master Kong Min. Gu-chanu was no longer himself. He had no hair and eyes on him. His entire body had become skinny and even his wounds were no longer bleeding. But the skulls, or rather the faces of the hunters on the branches seemed to have revitalized. They looked at their new lord, Lamer. He said that now he would impart the will of the master on them. The eyes of the boys on the branches became emotionless. The tree itself lit up with dark mana. The glass fell to the floor with a rattle and shattered. The red-haired guy's whole body was shaking. His face was also on the branch. A beautiful girl was sitting beside him. She asked what happened. There was a lot of sweat on the guy's face. He was very scared, but he replied that nothing and everything was fine. He quickly got up from the couch and left. On the way he asked himself what it was just now, if it was magic illusion, but he thought it was impossible, because he did not feel magic at all. Someone was shouting loudly so that he could hear it even in the street. It was Huang Qiuho. His body was shaking and he was holding his head with his hands on his head, fear on his face, and a blond man was standing beside him, asking him what was wrong and why he was suddenly screaming. Huang Qiuho replied in a trembling voice that it was nothing. Ahead of him was a tall multi-story building. Inside, a man in a business suit was sitting in his office. He looked ahead. Then he pressed the call button and they asked him if there was anything they could help him with. The man asked Huang Sangwook if he was in charge of the returned Kong Hyuk. He ordered him to pour out to come in to see him. Sangwook had already appeared in the doorway. He climbed out of there and apologized. He asked if he had called him. The man asked him if he noticed anything suspicious when he was interrogating Kong Hyuk. Sangwook asked what he meant. The man replied that using his hunting instincts, did he notice anything strange or dangerous about the guy? Sangwook replied that no, nothing like that, saying he was just depressed about his brother's death. The man furrowed his eyebrows but remained silent and looked at Sangwook carefully. Sangwook asked the president what happened, asking him to tell him and he would handle it. Then the president told him to contact all the hunters who fought against Kong Min and tell them it was an emergency. Sangwook was greatly surprised. He asked how is it so sudden and an emergency? The president calmly replied that they will discuss the details personally, asked the guy to tell them to come to the conference room. Sangwook said he was clear. Kong Changsu saw a completely different picture in front of him from what it really is. A big elongated eye was now looking at him. The monster turned to Kong Changsu and said that he knew who killed Kong Min. The monster towered over Kong Changsu and touched his chin while smiling. Kong Changsu closed his eyes. He thought about the fact that they had clearly said that they were Kong Min's killers. In other words, someone knows that Kong Min didn't die in an accident. Then he thought of Kong Hyuk, the elder brother of the late Kong Min, who had recently returned to Earth and requested information from the association. Changsu knew that the documents contained information about Kong Min. Also, nothing was known about his abilities. Kong Changsu was actually afraid that Kong Hyuk might be a necromancer. He also wondered what kind of monster it was. He realized that it wasn't a skeleton, or a zombie, or even an undead using black magic. He realized that if it was an ordinary undead, he would have identified it immediately. Changsu wondered if Kong Hyuk had learned something about his late brother through necromancy. His phone rang. Kong Changsu told him to talk. He told him that he had already used the emergency contact network as he told him to. It was Huang Sangwook calling. Kong Changsu thought deeply. He didn't understand how he dared to challenge him so easily. The man thought that as a returnee, he should have only just adapted. Changsu smiled and decided that after all blood couldn't lie. A lot of people gathered in the hall for the association's conference. One guy started talking. He said that summarizing the current situation, the returned one was Kong Min's older brother and he was targeting them. The Gargoyle Guild's crematorium was destroyed. And Gu Chanu and his entire assault squad were wiped out. The guy said that they couldn't turn a blind eye to this, asking what could have caused such actions. The other man sat calmly in his seat. Then said that things are coming to a point where Kong Hyuk thinks that the death of Kong Min, his brother, wasn't an accident. People started whispering amongst themselves. One guy questioned and then asked if that meant he knew they were responsible for Kong Min's death. The girl next to him asked how someone who wasn't even on Earth could know about it. Kong Changsu replied that he hadn't realized that yet, but he said that it was obvious that Kong Hyuk saw them as his enemies and was going to act. He said that they needed to respond immediately. The guy asked what the deputy master had been doing all this time since it had gotten to this point. Kong Changsu replied that he had just finished sweeping the dungeon and was currently investigating. The guy said that even now that he would automatically become the leader of the Gargoyle Guild, he was just going to spend time in the dungeons. Asked if that was the case, Changsu replied that of course not. He had entered there before Kong Hyuk returned and the mission took longer because the dungeon was harder than expected. Then he said that was enough for now. Changsu really asked them to listen carefully to what he was about to tell them. He said that the association would hold a press conference about Kong Hyuk and publicly order his assassination. Someone said to deserve such a fate, Kong Hyuk had to have committed a serious crime, and so he asked how would they explain it. Some girl intervened, saying they could just make something up. Kong Min died because he committed a crime. She said it was like that before the awakening and after, because history is written by the winners. Someone asked, then what kind of crime should it be? Saying that according to these reports, he had destroyed the Gargoa Guild's crematorium staff, killed Guchanu along with his squad, and killed the guild staff and members at the club. People were saying that in order to deal with Kong Hyuk, they would need more hunters than they had anticipated. They should think about the battle with Kong Hyuk and strategize accordingly. To do that, they would need to get every hunter in South Korea to wish Kong Hyuk dead. One guy started to reason that there are about 40 million people using abilities. Even if they exclude people without abilities, they would still have to get the majority of South Korea's users involved in the hunt for him. The guy asked if that was even possible, saying that not all hunters are willing to kill for no reason. Another guy told him that they would have to offer a large sum of money to get them interested, saying that a lot of hunters make money from dungeons and not everyone is willing to accept the risks involved. Kang Chang-soo offered to offer a stay at Kongnam Castle as a reward. This stunned everyone present. One guy asked the president if he had lost his mind, asked what he was going to do about the consequences. Another guy said that those 40 million would go nuts if you offered them something like that, saying that if the president was confident of handling the consequences, he believed. He thought for a moment, then asked if he really thought it would take 40 million to kill Kong Hyuk. The guy thought it was an absolutely egregious reward, and also completely irrational. He said that Gangnam Castle is a place for a select few. Mishandling the bounty could lead to internal conflicts between the hunters. The guy suggested assuming that the hunters kill Kong Hyuk, but who will Chang-soo give the castle residents' rights to? If they redistribute the residents' rights, the castle residents will declare war on them. However, if they deny the bounty, the hunters will revolt. He turned to the president, saying that he would later become a new hunting target and their safety would also be jeopardized, given that Gangnam Castle has stronger ties with foreign nations than South Korea. Kang Chang-soo replied that what they need to do now is to prevent Kong Hyuk from doing anything further. He said that simply breaking their forces into squads would only buy him time. It would be extremely ineffective, explaining that this was a direct provocation on his part. They should take tough and decisive action to make him regret coming back to Earth at all. People believe that if all the hunters of the country united, they could consider Kong Hyuk already dead, but the real problem lies in the consequences. They said that the statement "kill him and get the right to live in Gangnam Castle" without careful discussion could lead to a war between the association and the castle. They don't want that, and therefore the right of residence should be a last resort. Kang Chang-soo agreed and said then they will do this. He said he will hold a press conference and publicly announce Kong Hyuk's crime. He will present him as a threat and the main enemy of the society who is challenging those with abilities. They will take further action based on how people react. One guy agreed with him. He said that they still don't know about all of Kong Hyuk's abilities. The girl next to him nodded and added that that's why they should proceed with caution. If possible, decide everything within the guild. She said that if he turns out to be stronger than they expect, they can resort to offering to live in the castle to rally the hunters. So she suggested to wait and see. Chang-soo stood up and announced that this concludes today's meeting. He turned to Mr. Wong and asked for all arrangements, telling him that he himself would start the press conference immediately. Wong shouted that it was accepted. Inside the building was a pile of bloody bodies. Someone could still be sitting, or even standing. It was night. Everything was in darkness. One guy was terrified. He had a deep wound in his stomach and head, but he was still breathing. The whole floor and all the walls were smeared with bright red blood. The guy was walking leisurely down the corridor. A skeleton was already coming up behind him. Suddenly, he hit the strange guy on the back. He cried out loudly. The poor guy fell face down with a thud. Then another guy raised his head. He was also terribly scared, but had to see if he was gone. It was pouring rain outside the window. The second guy noticed a walkie-talkie on the floor nearby. He decided that he needed to get in touch with them as soon as possible, and it was extremely hard to get there. His whole body was covered with wounds, and he was shaking a lot. However, he did reach the walkie-talkie. The guy wondered where the monster had come from. The radio hissed and the guy brought it up to his mouth, telling the boss to run. From there came a loud and prolonged "no," and then a scream of pain. The poor guy flinched. Then another skeleton grabbed him by the hair and pulled him back, the guy begging loudly to let go. A pool of blood splattered right in front of him. Whose blood it was unclear, however the skeleton was also stunned. A man started walking towards them. That's when the guy realized that he was a corpse from now on. He cast his eyes downward. The unknown person came very close to him. It was Kong Hyuk. He was looking out the window and asking the guy if he knew why he was here. The guy already had tears in his eyes. He didn't want to answer him at all. He felt like if he answered, he would die. He was shaking and then he made the first sound. He looked up at Kong Hyuk, pleading with him, saying he would do anything. Kong Hyuk sat on a chair with his legs crossed. He was leaning on his arm relaxedly. He was staring at the poor guy with his red eyes while he was begging him to save him. The boy tearfully begged Kong Hyuk to spare him. Then the main character told him to bring a list of names. He sat and looked at the poor guy from above. The guy smiled and in a trembling voice asked what the list was. Lamer appeared out of the portal in the air. He explained that he needed a list of those responsible for young Master Kong Min's death. At that moment, Kong Hyuk saw something in Gu Chanu's memories. The guy lowered his head down, cold sweat running down his forehead. He finally stood up. All of his clothes and shoes were covered in blood. The guy walked past Kong Hyuk and guessed what Kong Hyuk wanted. Lamore escorted the guy with a look. The guy pressed a section in the wall and he fell through the wall, which pleased him. Unexpectedly to himself, a whole cabinet of secret materials appeared in the wall. There were files of different people, men and women, as well as charts, and most importantly, pictures of Kong Min. Kong Hyuk was looking through all of this and said that it was great. He had a thick book of information in his hands. The guy thought it was over and he was saved, so he asked what else he could do for Kong Hyuk and his buddy. Kong Hyuk kept his eyes on the book and Lamore started talking. Someone touched the guy's face and he got really scared and yelled aloud no. There were two skeletons behind him. They held him down and threatened him with a sword. Now the guy was hysterical. He begged them not to do it. Kong Hyuk slammed the book shut and looked at the suffering guy. Soon the guy's head was gone, his body lying on the floor and bleeding. Lamore raised his staff to him. Everything around him immediately turned purple. Smoke began to emanate from the guy's severed neck. It was one of the skulls on Lamer's staff, blowing on his neck. Oteho watched this quietly. He didn't realize how he would take advantage of it. Kong Hyuk's skeletons continued the merciless slaughter. All the members of the crypt sect after invading their office. The members of the organization fought back as hard as they could but their chances were slim to none. Lamore followed Kong Hyuk and collected souls, walking ominously between the rows of corpses. Odeho watched Kong Hyuk sitting on the couch, wondering what he planned to do with all those souls. Suddenly, his phone rang, so unexpected that Odeho flinched. It turned out that it wasn't his phone, but a watch. Oteho had found it in his pocket, but he didn't know what it was. This startled and stressed the guy out a lot. Lamore turned his attention to it. There was a news program on TV. There was a girl telling him that a public order had been issued to kill the returned Kong Hyuk. Then Kong Changsu was shown. He greeted everyone with a good morning. Odeho was pointing his finger at the screen and apologized loudly to get the attention of the two. He said he thought they needed to see this. On the screen, Kong Changsu talked about Kong Hyuk being a heinous criminal who committed a series of murders after his return, saying that after a thorough investigation, they have to inform the public. Kong Hyuk looked at the screen carefully. It seemed like Kong Hyuk and Kong Changsu were sitting across from each other, and Changsu was saying that after returning to Earth, Kong Hyuk refused to adapt to the established order. Said that he had massacred civilians mercilessly because of delusions about his own brother's death. The Gargoa Guild would also make an announcement on the case soon. Changsu said that they as an association want to say with this, please judge and do justice yourself so that Kong Hyuk can no longer dishonor the memory of his brother Kong Min. It was broadcast on all the screens. People watched and listened to it even on the street. Kong Changsu asked the residents to inform the association if they discover it. Even cafes and restaurants were showing the program. Changsu said that for their own safety, they should not try to confront him as he is a returnee. He said they would pay a generous reward to those who succeeded in apprehending Kong Hyuk, and they wouldn't hold him accountable if he died in the process. Odeho was in a panic, yelling that it turns out they already knew about everything that happened at the crematorium and the club. He was saying they needed to get out of here right away. Kang Hyuk just calmly continued reading. Then Daeho stopped and wondered what he was doing. He pondered that right now Hyuk must be coming up with a plan. He was also wondering what was in that ledger that he was concentrating on it like Hwang Kyul watching adult sexy movies. Daeho knew that the longer he was with Kang Hyuk the less he understood him. The book desirably laid out information about the bastards that killed Kang Min. Kang Hyuk studied it all and it confused him that it definitely couldn't be everyone involved in his murder. Kang Hyuk stood up and decided to check it out after he got rid of them. He headed to the door and the skeleton opened it for his lord. Daeho was surprised and hurriedly asked where he was going. He ran after him and even managed to short-circuit. He said next time Hyuk at least gave him a warning. Kang Hyuk turned around and told the guy to go wherever he wanted to go. This surprised Daeho even more. He was literally speechless and asked again. Daeho stood in the middle of a pile of corpses and a sea of blood. He was shocked and a little scared. He remembered Kang Hyuk's face and words that he could go wherever he wanted now. Daeho asked himself, what do you mean where you want to go? Did I really just get dumped? Then he got a notice on his watch that comes to all members of the Gargoa Guild Assault Squad. It asked him to check for information on Kang Hyuk and notify all guild members immediately if you see him. Daeho didn't realize what the hell that was. Suddenly, his phone in his back pocket rang. He picked up the phone. He was a little scared who it was. The guy on the other side asked if he was alive and where he was. Daeho immediately recognized Hwang Kyoho's voice. He asked why he was wondering. Hwang Kyoho didn't like it and asked if Daeho wanted to die. He asked if he was with Kang Hyuk at the club and then at the crematorium. Daeho stammered. Kyoho shouted that Daeho was trash and a corpse. He shouted that he only joined Kang Hyuk because he was Kang Min's older brother. Daeho was covered in cold sweat. He asked what Kyoho was talking about. Kyoho asked if he thought he could rise in the guild that way. Daeho told Captain Hwang not to be like that because he hadn't done anything. Hwang shouted into the phone that he was a stupid idiot and not to spill his guts to him. He asked where all the other guys were. Did Kang Hyuk kill them all? Daeho wondered what he should do next. He realized that Kang Hyuk had just left him here like he didn't care about him at all. He also realized that Hwang Kyoho must have seen him enter the club with that monster. And the cameras in the crematorium could have caught it. Daeho knew he couldn't die that easily. Hwang Kyoho shouted that he was a complete idiot and asked if he was going to say anything. He said that Daeho must be feeling guilty. He assured the guy that he was already dead. He promised to cut Daeho into pieces if he just waited. Kyoho said that Kang Hyuk would die in front of him, and Daeho saw the picture of Kang Hyuk and his sister lying dead in front of his eyes. And Hwang Kyoho was saying that while his sister would become his toy, said that Daeho knew exactly what he meant. After saying that, Daeho immediately dropped the call. His hand went down. He walked forward without saying anything. There was a tall glass building up ahead. That's where Kang Hyuk was walking along with the skeleton. Someone was watching him, and told someone else that the target had been located. It was two young men. They were sitting on the roof of a building nearby. One said that Kang Hyuk was there and asked how he should proceed. From the walkie-talkie he was told not to do anything until the guild's deputy master got there, just to keep an eye on him. The red-haired guy said that as expected Kang Hyuk was here. The other guy said it was a bit strange. Didn't he see the message? The guy said that if it were him, he would never stick his nose out again. There were more guys up on the roof. The long-haired one asked what was in it for them, saying that they should just keep an eye on him. The deputy guild master himself would take care of him. However, he also wondered how strong this guy was since he forced the association president to make his move. The other replied that it was obvious since he was Kang Ming's older brother. The black-haired one said that yes, he knows, but just because his younger brother is strong doesn't mean he is too. The red-haired one said that he is a returnee after all. Then the first one said that he was talking about the same thing. He knows too, and returnees aren't that rare nowadays. He said that Kong Chang-soo, the president of the association, was also a returnee as well as the vice president. He asked if they were making too much fuss just because he was Kong Min's brother. Then the other called him a fool and said that Kong Min had told him about the place where he and his brother had been drafted, but only Kong Min had returned. He said that he couldn't know all the details, but remembering Kong Min who came back, He could say that that place was horrible. He asked his buddy if he really thought that a person who came back from such a place would be weak, swore and advised him to use his brain in the future, if he had one, of course. He yelled that it must be really hard to carry around such useless brains. They had already literally started an argument and the other guys on the roof had to tell them to knock it off. The blonde guy told them not to forget the mission and not to let Kong Hyuk see them and to keep an eye on him themselves. The guys obeyed. They were already inside. The skeleton opened the doors to someone's office. Kong Hyuk went inside. And then stepped out into the courtyard. It was some kind of villa. His body began to glow with dark blue mana. He stretched his arm forward and told the dead to rise and the living to fall, and insects began to emerge from the grass and bushes. There were an awful lot of them and they were practically everywhere. There were many spiders and cockroaches of various kinds. They all flew toward the tall glass building. One smacked into the wall, leaving a green slime. So did all the others. There was a dark aura flowing from those divots. It all poured towards Kong Hyuk, and he ordered the 7th Legion of Gargoa to answer his call. The entire building was now in a black magic dome. One of the guys who had been following Kong Hyuk didn't understand why it was so dark. Another guy told him that it was nighttime and it would be dark. The other guys were told to be ready. The countdown began. All the hunters stood with their backs to each other, in defense. Then they were ordered to move forward. A car came